The last days of October were surprisingly weatherful. This year the autumn obviously decided that it had already spoiled people enough with blue sky, warm, tender sun, and bright colors. Abruptly changing its character, it dropped cold rain with wind on the city, which quickly tore off the golden leaves from the trees and made everyone, relaxed in the warmth, remember about warm jackets and hoods. Today it had been raining since the morning. The sky was hopelessly covered in a gray shroud, and it already felt like the sun, warmth, and light had been gone for a very long time. Brandy sat on a bench under a birch tree. The huge branches of the old tree still had a decent amount of leaves and some protection from the rain. She was wearing the light jacket she'd rushed out of the house in a hurry. It was a thin summer jacket that offered no protection from the cold wind or the raindrops falling down her neck. She shivered and shoved her hands in her pockets, trying to keep warm. Her mood matched the weather surprisingly well. It was just as cold and empty, and the future, even the very near future, seemed gray and hopeless. How did we get to this point? Brandy thought wistfully. Why did we let things get this far? And more importantly, what do we do now? Resentment at the injustice, frustration and anger, confusion and loneliness all came over her at once with such force that she even shuddered. The feelings were tearing her apart, crowding her head, and tears boiled in her eyes, powerless and therefore useless. She slipped her fingers as deeply as she could into her pockets and suddenly felt something hard in her right pocket. Pulling the object out of her pocket, she clenched her fist. In the palm of her hand lay a small, scratched bronze keychain. In the center of the metal oval, the teeth of an amusing dragon smiled merrily. Brandy had been born in the year of the dragon, and this keychain, which she had long thought lost, had been given to her many years ago as a keepsake by her grandfather. The human stared at the find, scrutinizing the long, curved tail covered in scales like tenacious paws and the cheeky crest on the mythical creature's back. And suddenly she heard a quiet but clear, husky voice with a slightly mocking intonation. "Don't cry. Don't be afraid. Don't ask." She flinched and looked around in panic to see whoever had spoken the strange words. She was still completely alone in the small yard strewn with wet fall leaves. The only sounds around her were the peaceful rustling of the rain and the disgruntled cat's meow. She covered her eyes. Such familiar, but long-forgotten words rang in her head, and suddenly everything fell into place. Her head, which had just been filled with a fog, cleared up. It became perfectly clear, as if a light had suddenly been turned on in a stuffy, dark room and all the windows had been opened. Even the chill gave way to a warmth that spread inside. She felt calm, a little scared, and even surprisingly in this situation, a little cheerful. It was as if she had found her grandfather's trinket, a confidence she had lost forever. Now she knew exactly what she should do. The solution was so simple and logical that she wondered why it had taken her so long to see it. Brandy stood up resolutely from the wet bench and strode toward the entryway. She was born in a small southern town. The family was large. The head of the household, John, had 3 sons and 2 daughters. One of those daughters, the youngest of all John's children, was Brandy's mom. Of course, when the girl was born, and the number of people living in the big house greatly decreased, everyone had long ago acquired their own families and homes. Some even left their hometowns. Only daughter Piper, who had become a widow many years before, and granddaughter Brandy remained with her father, who was well into his 50s. John was a remarkable man in every sense of the word, and the very first sense, the literal sense, was immediately apparent. John was strong and powerful. Tall, broad-shouldered, possessed, it seemed, of a molded, almost palpable strength, as if visible to the eye, which seemed about to tear his shirt. He was a true American Guiderman, as if on purpose to complete the resemblance to a different hero. He had blonde, slightly curly hair, gray eyes, and straight, clear, as if chiseled facial features. John was like a monument. And just like a monument, he was unwavering. His word was firm and unbreakable, his hand steady and strong, and his temper stubborn and uncompromising. John was feared in the settlement, but loved and respected. However, they ironically added that it was more expensive not to respect Johnson, and sometimes it was simply dangerous for life. The most surprising thing in all this was that John was not a local. Many years ago, he had come from nowhere, almost from New York, and stayed here. Married a local girl, started a family and a household, and for some reason it seemed like he'd been here forever, since time immemorial. Couldn't fit in New York. Apparently he got too crowded there, so they kicked him out. They laughed at him in the settlement. His life, too, fully corresponded to his appearance, was simple, thorough, and reliable in everything. He built a large, by local standards, just a huge house. He gave birth to 5 children, one healthier than the other, and planted a whole forest of trees. Many times the life plan of any man. However, he planted trees not only out of the call of his heart, but also out of duty. John was a forester. Then, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union and all its services, this position was renamed to forester. And even later, John was surprised to learn that he was now a forest protection inspector. The people of the settlement had another name for John's profession: forest man. Our John is an ordinary forest man, because even bears get out of his way. However, no matter how he was called, the essence of his work did not change. He was in charge of a huge area that required constant attention and hard work. For almost 30 years, John walked through forests and beams, planted trees and poachers, saved animals and people. John's wife was buried when his oldest son was 17 and his youngest, Piper, was 7. She died quietly in the hospital from some sudden infection. He grieved for her in a peculiar way, as in fact he did everything in his life. He simply disappeared for 2 weeks in the taiga alone with a gun and a dog and came back. Slimmed down, lightened with a calm and bright look, he looked around the children, as if rereading and making sure that everything was in place. Went to fix the swaying fence. Piper, as usual, had her own story full of joy and sorrow. But Piper, side her peers, who had already been in jail and had children and even grandchildren, was the first beauty in our girls. It was simply breathtaking. Nowadays they are not born like that. The people have become more popular. The boys swarmed around her like bees around honey, except John wouldn't let anyone near her. And then the unsuccessful suitors would puff themselves up with frustration and keep silent. In her maidenhood, Piper was a rare beauty, tall, statuesque, with blonde hair braided in a braid, blue eyes, and a straight nose. She looked like she had stepped out of an American beauty painting. John's children, jokingly referred to as his brood, were all one and the same. But the youngest daughter was especially good for him. When Piper was 20 years old, she fell in love with an engineer who came to the town to build a new school. The guy was very young, just graduated from the institute. He knew nothing about life and was taking his first steps in his profession. But he was absolutely sure of 2 things. First, the construction of a building should begin with the pouring of the foundation. And secondly, he could not imagine life without that blue-eyed girl. If John Smith, Piper's father, agreed with the first statement, he had serious objections to the second. He was not going to give his daughter to the city boy, as he called Alexis, looking at his frail physique against the background of his tall, broad-shouldered sons. Alexis showed rare persistence and perseverance, though he was noisily kicked out of the house twice when he tried to matchmake. A few times he was beaten or held by the chest with care, trying not to hurt anything. Someone particularly zealous even tried to remove the rival by dirty methods. Alexis was complained to the city that instead of his direct duties, i.e., construction of a school necessary for the town, he was engaged in his personal life during working hours. However, the authors of the complaint were quickly identified, forced to withdraw it, and rumor has it that John, outraged by the slander, made the grief writer ate his essay. Piper, scandalized, threatened to run away from home if her father behaves like a despot from the Middle Ages. She went on a hunger strike, tried to break dishes, but quickly stopped, spared the cups. Father laughed, replied that it would not hurt to lose weight. And about the dishes, she decided reasonably. Finally, the girl simply threatened her father that she wouldn't listen to him anyway, because she loved Alexis very much and wanted to marry him. John listened to Piper, sighed heavily, drank half a glass of whiskey, which had never happened to him before. He went to the next street, where a city boy lived. When he got there, he startled the landlady, piled into the room, sat the former Alexis in a chair, and stared at him with a heavy, judgmental look. "Well," he thundered, after a pause. "What do you mean?" Alexis barely found an answer, amazed at his visitor's logic and brevity. "Are you going to propose to my daughter, or are you going to embarrass her for the whole village?" The wedding was a real, heartfelt one for 3 days, after which the Smith family had to rebuild their finances for a very long time. Piper and Alexis were perfectly happy. The town loved them, though they made jokes about the young husband's thinness. "It's okay, we'll feed them," John calmly replied to the humorists. They frankly admired. Expressed it in a peculiar way. "Look, beautiful," whispered one woman to another, having met on the street. "Yesterday I came to the pond, and there Velichkin, and the lovebirds are sitting, holding hands in silence, looking at each other. I opened my mouth too, but I tripped on the threshold. So I stretched out. I called them all names: the devil, the angel, and someone else. And I banged my pelvis. And that's it. They didn't even turn around. Just two crazy people, laughing, swinging. John finished school and kissed Piper, who was 7 months pregnant. He went into town for a new assignment. He never made it back. The car he was rushing to Piper's house collided with an oncoming truck and flipped over. John was killed on the spot. John did not dare to tell his daughter what had happened for a long time, although he was informed of everything. Half an hour after the tragedy, he arrived at the scene of the accident, wandered along the side of the road, shaking his head as if trying to get rid of some obsession, and collected bags of baby clothes John had bought for his unborn baby girl, scattered in the mud. Piper had turned out to be a worthy daughter of her father. No one heard her complaints and tantrums. She listened to the terrible news, collapsed quietly, and, hugging her arms around her large belly, sank awkwardly into a chair. She named the baby girl by the rare name Brandy. She really liked the way it sounded. She was sure that the child's name held the future in some way. The child's destiny is actually 2 words for peace and fame, she explained to surprised relatives. So what? Together world fame? Are you going to raise a star? They ironized. Well, okay, as long as your snotty little starlet will grow up to the Oscars or the Olympics will not win. What should we call her, Mirko or Slavko? Slavko is a man's name. It's not Mirko or Slavko, it's Brandy. And you're being ironic about the star. We'll see about that, Piper said firmly. As for the grandfather, he acted in accordance with his character. When he heard his granddaughter's name, he was stunned. He looked at his daughter, twiddled his thumb at his temple, and suddenly said, "You can go as crazy as you want and call the child whatever you want, but I will call my granddaughter Marisa." And so it went. The girl, surprisingly enough, but the disagreement among the kin about her unusual name did not pay any attention, and to all appearances, inconvenience did not experience. She quite calmly and equally reacted to the demonstrative Brandy, which her mother insisted on, to the simpler to the world and to glory, which constantly slipped in the address of grandfathers, aunts, and other people. As for the not-so-logical address Marisa, that was Grandpa's prerogative. Only he called her that. And there was something special, mysterious about it, as if there was a secret between grandfather and granddaughter that was not available to others, and they were not going to reveal it to anyone. Why Marisa? Every now and then asked someone who had heard the grandfather address the girl for the first time. Because they both answered in a meaningful chorus. Brandy made a mysterious face, and Grandpa winked, hiding a smile. As the girl grew older, it became clear to everyone that she would be, if not as beautiful as her mother, then at least very much like Piper. Family, as they were called in the city, narrow gray eyes, lush blonde hair were clearly her mother's. But the lean, easygoing figure was a reminder of John, who wasn't meant to see his daughter. Brandy adored her grandfather, and anyone who saw the two of them could tell at a glance that it was mutual. John, who had disappeared into the woods for years and had been devastated when his own children were growing up, now took care of his granddaughter 24 hours a day. Despite Piper's protests, he rode her as a toddler on his fearsome-looking dogs, with whom he still went hunting on occasion. They painted themselves from top to toe with green for company with his granddaughter. When he picked up a wound, he would trot early in the morning to the neighbor's house for fresh milk. He proudly took Brandy, holding her hand, to first grade, when Brandy became seriously ill with the flu for the first time in her life. John literally went down with her. He couldn't eat or drink, sitting below, appearing at the door of Brandy's room, and listening to the ragged breathing of the sleeping girl. And when her temperature suddenly spiked, he turned so pale that Piper was seriously afraid for him, deciding who needed help first, daughter or father. When the girl grew up, she enthusiastically involved in the study of the forest, spending all vacations with her grandfather in his woodsman's old house. Laughing in the settlement, poor Brandy. How does she get along with that old scientist there? Look, Piper warned the neighbors. The girls lost her conversational skills. Everyone would be very surprised to learn that John and Brandy talked not just a lot, but a lot, and even got a little bored with each other and arguing about something to the point of hoarseness. both stubborn and unyielding. They were willing to defend their point of view to the last man. On her first visit to her grandfather's forest dwelling, the girl was amazed to find that almost an entire wall of the old hut is occupied by shelves densely packed with books and magazines. "And you read all this?" the girl asked in amazement, running her finger along the book spines. "Well, let's put it this way," John smirked. "Here's Dickens, for instance. What are they?" "Well, tell me the title." "Empty Hopes." High Hopes. Brandy laughed at the word. "So started reading 10 pages, got through, and that was it. Can't go any further." Falling asleep, John admitted. "Yeah, right," the girl rejoiced. "That's right, and it's exactly the same with me. Imagine I say to our teacher, Irina Viktorovna, it's impossible to read. And she said to me, well, then 2 for the quarter. Can you imagine I had to read? And only agonized like." "Hello, here we are. War and Peace," said John. "Well, you're wrong. Don't you dare speak ill of that work. I'm not a literary critic. I don't even get to discuss books like that." "Yes," he continued. "Well, tell me then, if you are such a connoisseur of literature, why does Tolstoy write half the book in French? And then the same thing is repeated in Russian. Why is that? Did they forget to ask you?" John put his hands out expressively in front of him and shook his fists. To convey the spirit of the times, he answered himself. "I think it's to make the book thicker and sell more," Brandy said snidely. "Oh, you," John exclaimed. "But you, Brandy, are quite choked up with resentment for the great Russian writer." Such arguments occurred to them regularly and ended, as a rule, in a draw. Each remained in his own opinion, although he thought about his opponent's position. John did this especially often. "Brandy's a smart girl, after all," he chuckled. "I listen to her, but she's talking nonsense. And then I start thinking, and it turns out she's not so wrong." Often they would just sit on the porch of the old forest cabin, and as John said, listen to the woods. "Say, Grandpa, don't you ever get bored out here? I mean, you've lived here alone for weeks on end, haven't you?" the girl asked. "But why not?" he grinned. "It has happened, so seized, that with the wolves," in one voice howled. "I've had all sorts of things, but not enough to run to town. My forest is better than any city. I love it." "Is it true that you were born in Moscow?" she asked a question that had long interested her. "True," he nodded. "Only it was so long ago that it doesn't seem true anymore. And it doesn't exist anymore, my Moscow. It's quite different. I should very much like to see it." "I wish I could go," said the girl dreamily. "Well, why, and will you go?" John said. "When you get a little older, I'll send you to meet your grandmother." "What grandmother?" Brandy marveled. "Yours." "But hell, I've never been good at these names. Who's who to whom? Who's who? Probably your great-grandmother. Who's she to you?" "Anyway, my own sister Zinaida. She still lives in Moscow. We haven't seen each other for 15 years, but I write letters regularly. She answers. I call her to visit. And she calls me to her. Yes, I guess it's not fate anymore." "But you'll go by all means," John said. Brandy looked at the man in surprise. "Well, where? Wow, he has a sister in Moscow. Why did you leave Moscow?" "Yeah, I think the right question to ask is why was I born there?" John grinned. "I'm not a city person, I guess. And it all worked out that way. Zina grew up, she had a family. I put them in our parents' apartment. Everyone died in the war. It was just the 2 of us. I graduated from the institute, got a distribution, and came here." "You studied at an institute in Moscow?" Brandy asked in surprise. "Tonight was clearly a night of discovery," she continued. John grinned again. "I'm not as much of a hermit as everyone thinks. I'm actually the terribly educated type. I'll show you all around here yet." The girl listened to her grandfather with her mouth open. She heard about her grandmother from Moscow one more time, when the grandfather suddenly, to the amazement of the whole village, quickly packed up and left for the city. From there he left by airplane. To Aunt Zina, Papa's sister. Her husband died, Piper quietly explained to her daughter. John returned a month later, scowling and particularly taciturn. As had been his habit for years, he had gone off alone for a few days in the taiga. Brandy realized that this was her grandfather's way of muffling his sadness, that the forest helped him through his grief. Brandy's school years flew by. During this time, Piper had 3 more grandchildren, and of course all of them he loved, brought up and tried to make men. But his firstborn granddaughter, his adored little girl, Brandy, forever held a special place in his heart. After high school, Brandy decided to go to the city to enroll in a teacher training institute. "I'll get my degree and come home. I'm going to work as a teacher at my dad's school," she explained to her family. The memory of her father, whom she never saw, the girl carefully kept in her heart. The words "dad's school" decided everything. The evening before they left, Brandy and John sat side by side on a huge rock which, warmed by the day's sun, stood like a lonely guardian over the river cliff. They sat there in silence. The girl thought with joyful excitement about tomorrow and about the new, completely different life that would begin for her very soon. John pondered anxiously. He would feel much safer if Brandy, for example, went into the woods alone, into the middle of nowhere. The city, where he hadn't traveled out of the settlement in years, was firmly associated with the jungle, far more dangerous than the usual taiga. The dangers that lurked there for his little girl were more serious than bears and ticks. Brandy, he finally broke the silence and took his granddaughter's hand. "You know, I'm not a big expert on life. There's a reason I'm nicknamed that, but I still remember some things. I want to tell you something. Many years ago, my father said, and I've lived by those rules all my life, and they've gotten me through many times." Brandy listened to her grandfather very carefully. He had never spoken to her in such a tone before, solemn and a little sad at the same time. "There are 7 commandments, Brandy, just 7. They're simple and very human, sort of. Don't believe, don't be afraid, don't ask, don't cry, don't wait, don't fuss, don't hope. That's it. I even wrote them on a piece of paper so you wouldn't forget them." He thrust a piece of checkered paper into her hand. She looked at it, moving her lips, reading what was written, turned her gaze to the river, behind which the June sun was sinking, and thought for a long time. "Look, well, don't ask, don't be afraid, don't cry, I understand. The don't mess around is understandable too. But what about don't believe, don't hope? So believe only in yourself, and hope only in yourself. It'll be easier that way. And you, what are you, grandfather? What are you teaching me? Am I not supposed to trust even you? And can't I hope in you or something?" John lowered his head and said, "I will always be there for you. No matter how far away I am in doing so, remember that. But what I told you is also firmly planted in everyone's head. This conversation is over. Let's go home and let your mother decide before I do." Brandy went to the big city of New York and enrolled in teacher training school. Despite the fact that she came from a small village, she quickly adapted to the city and student life. Cheerful, well-read, not going for a word in her pocket. The girl successfully mastered the educational program because appearance, no matter what they say, plays a very important role. She was also doing well, and the rare, unusual name invariably drew attention to her. "What's your name?" her peers, her professors, her dorm neighbors regularly asked. Great Brandy finally went to New York City after her sophomore year. Zina Sergeyevna, Uncle John's younger sister, welcomed Brandy with open arms. The girl entered the cool twilight of a huge apartment with ceilings of unprecedented height. She found herself in the unexpectedly tight embrace of a short, thin woman with a kind face on which John's eyes shone, a native New Yorker. She had lived in her hometown all her life, loved and knew it inside and out. Zina, like most children, in that terrible, but still in its own way happy time, remembered nothing. She had no one except her brother. John essentially raised her. In the early 50s, she married a young and hopeful student. However, Zina did not know about any hopes and just fell in love head over heels, as brother John put it. A few years later, it turned out that James, that was her husband's name, a very talented physicist, engaged in atomic energy. This branch of science was on an unprecedented rise. The Institute of Atomic Energy was founded. James, along with other young scientists, worked in it under the guidance of academician Kurchatov himself. The work was, of course, of national importance, and most of the top secret. Even his favorite wife, Jane James, could not tell what he was doing, and it was not really necessary. "I still do not understand anything, James," she laughed merrily, cheerfully tapping her fingers on the keys of the typewriter. Jane herself, having finished 9 classes and courses, worked as a typist in a New York institute, loved her husband, and was perfectly happy. John by that time had graduated from the Institute of Forestry Technology, or, as it was simply called, forestry, and went to work somewhere very far away, several thousand kilometers away in the taiga. For the first few years, he'd come to his hometown to see them. rejoiced to see his sister, marveled at James's success, bought bags full of gifts for his own, and disappeared again for years. Then he finally settled down in the middle of nowhere, got married. Zena couldn't stand it, took a vacation and flew to his wedding. John was exactly as she remembered him, only even stronger, mightier, with a beard like Elia Muramet's, all soaked in the smell of pine and smoke, which seemed to be absorbed into his skin and hair forever. He picked his sister up in his arms, hugging her as he had once done in their distant childhood. Then John had children one by one. He and Zena wrote letters to each other, sent pictures. But of course it wasn't the same. James made very great strides in science. For 15 years he went from graduate student to professor, received several government awards. The young family moved several times, and each time the apartment was larger and more luxurious than the previous one. Finally, in the mid-60s, James got a huge 4-room apartment in the center of the city, on the Hudson River waterfront. Zena timidly entered the hallway, which alone was probably the size of half of their previous dwelling, and looked fearfully at her reflection in the huge, full-length mirror. "Do you hear that?" For some reason she asked in a whisper. "Why do we need so many rooms?" "What do you mean why?" James smiled, hugging his little frightened wife. "One room will go for my office. I am some kind of scientist after all. The other will be yours. And you'll stop nagging that I'm always mixing your books and mine. And you have to read a physics textbook instead of a love story." He laughed. "The third room is the living room, the fourth." He faltered and coughed. "The fourth would be the nursery, but still." Amber gently released herself from her husband's embrace. She walked to the mirror and thoughtfully drew a funny face with her finger on the dusty surface of the glass. It was a difficult conversation for both of them. Despite their best efforts and passionate desire to have children, or at least one child, nothing had worked so far. Was there something wrong with Amber, or was the cause James, who, having spent many years in science, could have and surely had received some radiation doses, or been exposed to some other little studied and therefore safe exposure? Who knows, the result was the same. They had no children. "Nursery," Amber said, as if listening to the sound of the word. "Who's the nursery for?" "James." She grinned bitterly at her reflection in the mirror and shook her head. "You know, I got a letter from John. He's already had his 4th child. He's got 2 girls and 2 boys. It's just that I guess John got all the fertility in our family. And I have nothing left," she joked sadly. "Don't be so upset." James came over to her and took her hand. "We still have a lot of time ahead of us. You know, I have an idea. I'll take a vacation this summer, and we'll go to John's place. Maybe the place is so generous with kids there." "Why?" "I think it's a great idea. We're not going anywhere, because of course you're not taking any vacation." "I've heard that many times," Amber said cheerfully. Still, they loved each other very much and were happy. Until James died. Once again, John had saved him, helped him out, lent his shoulder and his hands. Sitting by James's coffin, Amber, blind with tears, looked up, saw John, who had come from nowhere, and immediately felt lighter, brighter, and a little less painful. She wasn't alone anymore. John had been with her for a month. He sat by her bedside, calmed her tantrums, wiped her tears, made her eat, changed the compresses on her head, read books aloud to her, took her for walks, leading her by the hand like a little girl. For some reason she could not stop crying and constantly tried to complain about her fate. "I am afraid, what will I do now? How to live? I don't know how to live without James." "Oh, Amber, you've forgotten all that. You've broken all our commandments. I taught you once, remember? Did you? Let's do it again. Don't cry, don't be afraid, don't ask. Stop crying, drink some water. Well done. And calm down. Wipe your nose. All right, Amber." Finally, in the morning when she opened her eyes, she got out of bed, washed her face with cold water, and knocked. She went into the next room, where her brother was snoozing awkwardly, curled up on a sofa too short for him. "John," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "Thank you. I'm all right now, aren't I? You should go home to your kids, to your forest. You go. Just write to me, please. Please write to me." Amber was alone in her huge professor's apartment with a small but very serious, according to experts, collection of paintings, library and letters of her brother from distant Siberia. When John suddenly called, she was even frightened. Was something wrong? She knew well his dislike of telephone conversations. "Well, it's nothing." Some conversation, he grumbled. "You can't see a person's eyes." "What are you saying?" You don't think. We're just talking nonsense. Just to pass out quickly. He wrote letters with an old-fashioned, thorough thread. Long and interesting, carefully considered, written in the wonderfully smooth, beautiful handwriting of Brother John's letters. It was a miracle for his huge hands. Amber looked forward to them with great impatience, and when she received them, she always made a ritual of reading them. She didn't tear open the envelope on the fly or run her eyes over the lines of the letter as she walked up the stairs to the apartment door, as she usually did when she received a long-awaited message. No, she brewed her favorite tea, poured it into an elegant porcelain mug, and sat down at the small table that James, knowing his wife's habits, jokingly called the writer's table, with an antique silver paper cutting knife. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the tightly written pages. After reading her brother's messages, Amber leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. It seemed to her that for a while she was transported there, many hundreds of miles away, and saw John, his graceful, inexplicably kept slim after so many children, his wife Nancy, his noisy and cheerful nephews. A large, cozy, hospitable house, and a dark green wall of forest rising beyond the edge of the village. And suddenly a call from John. "What's wrong?" Amber asked immediately. She still couldn't forgive herself for not going to the funeral of Nancy, her brother's wife, because then she'd left everything behind when James was gone. He flew in and spent a month comforting her in her grief. "Hello, Amber." "Nothing's wrong," he reassured her. "I just called to check on you. I have a favor to ask." "What kind of request?" Zenaida gasped, for the first time in her life hearing from her brother this word. "Yes, Amber. That's what it is. So Brandy, my granddaughter, Brandy." He pronounced his granddaughter's name a little awkwardly. "She's really excited about New York, seeing the capital. Will you come?" "Oh my God, of course, John, I'd be so happy." Amber was so excited she almost dropped her phone. "Anytime, maybe you'll come, John. I'd love to see you." "I miss you too, Brandy." John's voice trembled. "I guess I'll never get around to it. Piper." "Jesus Christ, Brandy. It's coming in on the 20th, so meet me in New York." Brandy, as usual, was stunned and amazed. Sure, she'd spent the last 2 years in the city, but compared to the capital, it seemed as small a town as the one she'd been born in. "What do you want to see in New York?" Amber asked, sitting the pink-haired girl down at the kitchen table and putting a steaming bowl of borscht in front of her. "Everything," she declared. "Well, then you need to quit the institute and move in with me for a year and a half," laughed the woman. "Let's do it this way. You and I have a week. Every day we'll devote to one serious attraction. Well, for example, the Metropolitan Opera or the Museum of Modern Art. I'll show you the city in between. You eat, honey, eat. New York doesn't like hungry people." "Are you kidding? It's a shame to waste time eating." "There's so much I want to do." Brandy looked at Amber carefully. "You were raised by John, right? Then you must know his famous commandments. What family's granddaughter are you violating right now?" "Stay out." Brandy exhaled. "There," laughed the woman. "Good for you." When the first wave of excitement subsided, Brandy, under Amber's guidance, began to explore New York City carefully and thoughtfully. The woman showed her hometown with love and pride, and it was a very different New York. It wasn't the bustling, parade-like New York that millions of tourists imagine it to be, but old, stately, and beautiful in its own special way. Brandy was thrilled, and Amber watched the girl with amusement. Wow, John's granddaughter. What an amazing mix of her grandfather's features and some other blood in her. Probably her father, that boy who died so tragically and ridiculously. Oh yeah, her mom Piper, of course. She looks a lot like John. And how beautiful she was when she was young. I remember that James, having seen a picture of Piper, said that with such a look should not live in a Siberian village and on the modeling runway, especially now Russian beauty is again, as they say, in fashion. Of course, the daughter is not as beautiful as her mother, but still a charming girl. And what a wonderful character. Cheerful and at the same time attentive, thoughtful. Always has her own opinion, but so great able to listen and so sensitive to the beautiful. At the ballet Giselle, which they saw at the Metropolitan Opera House, at intermission Brandy became suspiciously quiet. "Brandy, hurry up and get up. Come on, while we take a break, I'll show you the circular hall, the so-called Little Imperial Foyer." The acoustics in there are amazing. If you whisper something, the walls and ceiling will amplify it 100 times over. Your grandfather once told me that he had imperial foyers like that in the woods along the river. Where the rocks stick out, she laughed, and stopped when she saw that the girl hadn't moved. Brandy, what's wrong? She sat down next to her and noticed that her eyes were red. Nothing, Brandy said quietly. It's awful. This ballet of yours. Why is everything so beautiful and sad? Why did she have to die? You mean Giselle? Amber finally figured it out. Oh girl, I'm so sorry, you old fool. I didn't realize you were so worried. Frankly speaking, Amber didn't suspect such sensitivity in a Siberian girl who grew up in a small southern village. After all, judging by her stories, she had grown up in a simple environment, without any frills. She'd spent a lot of time in the woods, and she didn't look like a graduate of a boarding school for noble maidens. From that point on, Brandy became even more interesting to watch. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she quietly walked from one world-famous painting to another and sighed softly. What's up? Amber asked when they returned home and sat in the large, cozy kitchen, drinking tea and putting another New York day in their heads. Amazing, Brandy exhaled. Only everything in my head is all mixed up. Amber, if I had many lives, I'd spend one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see one painting a day. No, it's not like that. One painting a day for 3 days. I'd look at it and then I'd leave. You see, I think that's the only way to really look at and understand a painting. Some people it's easy. Well, she didn't really have the words. I didn't particularly like Ayvazovsky. When I was looking at the 9th shaft, I thought for a second that I was about to drown. They laughed merrily. I must seem like a provincial fool to you, Brandy asked. No, girl, you're not stupid, you're smart. Amber smiled. And you're also my John's child. Well, maybe a granddaughter, but still, grandchildren are our children too. She suddenly stopped talking and then continued. You look just like him, don't you? And just like him, you know how to surprise. Do you love your grandfather very much? Yes, Brandy asked. You mean your brother? Very much. Amber answered and sat down on the soft corner sofa. John is the only person I have in the whole world. When he and I were left alone after the war, he basically replaced my parents. If it wasn't for him, I could have starved to death. There's a 100% chance I would have ended up in an orphanage. John wouldn't let me go. I remember yelling at the police officer so much that I was afraid they'd turn him in. He went to work to feed me. He wasn't even 14 yet. He lied desperately to get hired, adding his age. They believed him, of course, because he was already 2 heads taller than his peers, and healthy. It's even surprising how he grew up to be such a rich man. Amber, as if lost in herself, was suddenly silent. Are you sitting in a chair? Brandy looked at her. Well, naturally, you don't know that. Yes, the woman grinned. John didn't tell you that he'd been working 8 to 10 hours a day since he was 13, and then he'd come home at night, sleep for 3 hours, and run to school. And how I put another dependent around his neck. Like I wasn't enough for him. You don't know either? Amber smiled. I married James. And they literally had nothing but a suitcase of books and a lot of love. James was a student. I was taking classes. John put the 2 of us on his back. For almost 3 years we lived on his money, and he gave us his parents' apartment and moved into some doghouse. He said that newlyweds shouldn't have anyone crawling around. I took it all for granted back then. And then, as an adult, I realized if it wasn't for John, I might not even be alive. And even if I had, I don't know how my fate would have turned out. I owe everything in my life to my brother. Amber was silent again, for a long time. Brandy also sat quietly like a mouse, thinking where. Wow, he didn't even have a childhood. First the war, then a little sister in his arms. Working alongside adults is a real feat. That's how it really was. All she'd heard him say a couple times was, well, he was born in New York. Went to college. Got a sister, Amber. She grew up, I moved away, and that was it. Self. Then all of a sudden she conquered herself. Brandy for once really questioned him about how he used to live. Maybe he'd like to tell it all, but he'd never talk about it himself. He'd say it's nonsense. It's not a feat, it's just normal. Now you tell me, how do you live there? Amber changed the subject abruptly. We live well. Brandy smiled. She told her grandmother a long time about their house, her family, about her trips to the woods with her grandfather. Suddenly she realized that she missed her very much. The week in New York flew by. Brandy and Amber had become good friends. "You come visit me," Girl Amber said, wiping away her tears. "Anytime you want to come. You hear me? I feel so good with you. Like it's not just you, but John here with me. And you better pack up and fly to us." "No, really, Amber." Brandy's dressed. "How happy he'll be." What Amber laughed. "Maybe I'll fly over, what the heck." The next summer, Amber did make up her mind and came to visit. A shocked John treated his sister like a valuable crystal vase. He fumbled around the house for a long time, not knowing where to put Amber. He rejected one room because the light from the window was too bright, the other because it was too dark. The third room would be noisy because someone would be up at the crack of dawn. So he took away her suitcase and put her in one of the rooms overlooking the river, which she was perfectly happy with. Amber was surprisingly happy here. Who were all these people? She'd seen them all but John and Brandy for the first time in her life, except for the pictures her brother had sent her. But somehow they all seemed like family. The still very beautiful Piper. Her brother's broad-shouldered and gray-eyed looked a lot like John. Her second niece, Jane, in contrast to Piper's Skinny, their children. They were all somehow terribly related, as if she'd known them all her life. As if everything that had happened to them, and that she knew about from John's letters, she had lived with them. And the New York professor, by all accounts, was not at all what they had imagined her to be. Instead of the haughty metropolitan snootiness, there was a simple, kind sister-in-law who quickly changed into her simple outfits and immediately joined in the cooking. She laughed merrily at unpretentious jokes. Dashingly, laughingly wrinkling her nose, she clapped her hands several times. Then she supported the singing chorus with her soft but very beautiful voice. They recognized her as their own completely, and finally after she threw off her shoes and ran barefoot to the vegetable garden to get cucumbers for a snack. And then she did something that was not at all expected from a New York professor with an embarrassed ounce. She promptly jumped up from the bench and rushed in the direction of the street toilet. Our girl, one of the men, summarized, after spending several days in a continuous feast with relatives, acquaintances, and family friends eager to meet the New Yorker. Amber, feeling like she was about to burst from what she had eaten and drank, requested, "Take me into your forest, John," she asked. "I've heard so much about it from Brandy. I want to see your old lady book for myself. In fact, I want to see how you've lived all these years." "Hidden cook. You'll get mosquitoes all over you. Mary and I are used to it, but I'm afraid you can't stand it," said John hesitatingly. "I'll bear it. Please," Amber begged. In the evening they sat on the porch of the woodsman's cabin as usual. Only now there were 3 of them, and they listened to the woods. Before Amber left, the whole family sat around the table where all of John's children with their wives, husbands, and their children fit. At the head of the table were John and his sister, who even now, during the meal, touched each other every now and then. She put her hand under his, resting her shoulder against John's for a few seconds, then quietly touching his cheek. It was as if she was trying to use every moment to savor their closeness, the opportunity to see and hear the dear one. The generous table was set with everything that was imaginable and possible. The family was especially proud of their own apples grown on their homestead. No one around here has apples like Brandy's, the villagers readily admitted. Hell knows what they water with. They're the only ones with apples like that for some reason. The summer Amber came to visit, the apple crop had been especially bountiful. On the table, of course, was a platter of large, ruddy fruit. The woman, listening to one of her nephews, nodding her head, picked up an apple and brought it up to her face. Suddenly she froze, looked at her brother and giggled with a quiet laugh. Everyone looked at her in surprise. "You remember, don't you? We should." "Oh, I can't. We'd like some apples. An apple." She said something completely incomprehensible because she couldn't stop laughing, holding her side and swallowing the words. John looked at Amber in surprise, as if remembering something. Suddenly, obviously remembering, he smiled, waved his hand, and shook his whole body, laughing with his sister. "I remembered too," he said, and seeing the surprise of his relatives, waved his hand. "Yes, it's silly and nothing funny." "So Dad, tell me," Piper exclaimed. All those present joined her, demanding a story. "What's there to tell?" "Well, anyway, they were young, just married and moved into our apartment. I was working at the station, unloading wagons. So we'd been loading apples for a week, so I pocketed a few for my students. You stole them? Enthusiastically asked Peter, the eldest son with an almost completely gray head. Expropriate, said the father sternly. Not by the way the hope of the Soviet nuclear industry had to be fed. So one day I bring them apples, 2 days I bring them apples. 3 they clap, only the noise is worth. They ate everything, indiscriminately. Sometimes I even thought they didn't notice what they were eating. Even an apple or an old stick, they'd eat it all up in no time. And on the 4th day I forgot to take the apples. I forgot, that's all, I was too busy. So I came home and sat down to dinner. They, my students, are sitting next to me, studying books, as usual. I ate, they were silent. I did something. I walk around, smoke. They don't talk. So I went to bed. And then they raise their heads and say, "John, we'd like some apples." "That's ridiculous," I said. "It's not funny," said John, watching the whole family laughing. "You're a lucky man," John Amber said to him. "And I'm a lucky woman now, too." She kissed her brother on the cheek and felt the thread in the seam of his sleeve crack from his embrace. Brother and sister never saw each other again. Brandy was in her 4th year at the Institute of Money her mother and grandfather sent regularly. She had enough at first, especially since, over and above the agreed amount, John would periodically send her Mary more, as he said, a little something saved for smoke secretly from Piper. But appetite, as we know, comes at mealtime. And soon Brandy, having had a taste of city life, began to miss help from his family. And labor experience is never too much for anyone. So having passed the session, she did not return home, as she usually did, but went to work as a counselor at a summer camp. The job was difficult, hectic, but fun. After one particularly difficult day that had worn her nerves out, Brandy, as a counselor, was given a few days off during her shift. She decided to take advantage of the opportunity and get some rest. But she didn't go into town. She needed a different kind of vacation, a very special kind of vacation, the kind that Grandpa John had taught her to take. She missed the woods and the city. She hadn't realized this until she had lived city life for a couple of years. Now she understood perfectly well what was the point of John's periodic absences, as they were called in the family, when he went alone into the taiga and returned sometimes after 2 or even 3 weeks. It was so great to get somewhere far away, where there were no people, cars, buildings, asphalt. Nothing but tall, slender, like ships' masts, pine trunks stretching into the sky. How pleasant it was to feel under my feet not the rough hardness of the floor or asphalt, but soft springs, and with every step a carpet of thousands of layers of pine needles. Silence. The forest, after the endless noise and clatter of the city, at first fell on my ears, as if they were plugged with absorbent cotton, and then gradually the sounds of wind, birds, the creaking of branches and the rustling of leaves in the forest began to enter my head. My head became delightfully empty and light. Everything bad seemed to dissolve into the fresh, pine-scented air. Brandy wasn't afraid to get lost. She had grown up under her grandfather's guidance in the taiga on a plot of several dozen acres, able to find her way in the dark by signs and markings that only she could see. But it would be hard for her to get lost here, even if she wanted to. So she simply walked without thinking about the direction, without any purpose, immersed in the atmosphere of the forest, as only those who truly love and understand nature can do. That there were people ahead, she realized long before she saw them. The place was a tourist destination, and she was not surprised to see people here. She only grumbled unhappily and wondered what to do next. The forest was clearly down to the river, and she planned to go down to the bank, bypass the large ravine, and go upstream. From the sounds of it, the campers were positioned exactly in her path. She didn't want to go around the ravine. It was filled with old fallen tree trunks and was hardly passable even for her. There was only one way past the tourists. Brandy adjusted her backpack and strode determinedly toward the river. Her hunch was correct. The forest ended at a small cliff, and between it and the river was a cozy clearing, covered with smooth, emerald grass that looked like a perfect lawn. 2 cars were parked a little to the side. Several large, colorful cloths were lying on the grass, and in the middle of the clearing was a pile of piled things. A few people, like ants, were dragging individual items from this pile, sometimes bringing them back, taking something else, throwing them along the road. It all looked ridiculous and rather goofy. Urban Brandy concluded unmistakably. leaning against a pine tree and watching the hustle and bustle of tourists for a break. She stepped into the clearing. "Hello," she said loudly. There was an inaudible response. Judging by their faces, the people were not happy about something, and in general looked little like carefree young people who went on vacation in a pleasant company. "Hello, girl." She heard a normal human greeting behind her. Brandy looked back. Standing in front of her was a tall, broad-shouldered, and strong guy with dark hair. He was holding a cell phone in his hands, with his arm outstretched in front of him for some reason. "Excuse me, do you have internet?" he asked. "So you catch the internet?" She guessed the reason for the strange pose. "Well, what kind of internet can there be here? It's in the middle of nowhere, and it's blocked by a cliff and a rock. You have to climb to the top over there, and there might be internet there. You know what I mean? Why do you need internet in the wilderness? We got a new tent, but no instructions. We've already argued with each other, but still we can't figure it out. I want to go home." He smiled embarrassedly and spread his hands. "Idiocy. Fuck it all. And all of you and your camping came from the clearing." Judging by the expressions, another attempt to pitch a tent had failed again. Brandy smirked. "It's not going to work. I can see from here that you're trying to put it up inside out." She shrugged. "In fact, all tents are set up the same way, and you don't need instructions, and you picked the wrong spot. Too close to the river, you'll freeze at night. Come on, I'll help you." In a few minutes, a large, brightly colored tent was set up in the middle of the clearing, and the tent was stretched. While they were setting up the tent, Brandy learned that the group of 3 guys and 2 girls had indeed come from the city. As urban natives, they had a more theoretical idea of outdoor recreation. It seemed to them that everything was very easy and simple. A modern, expensive tent will literally unfold itself on the clearing. The fire will burst out cheerfully, and they themselves will only have to fry a tasty kebab and sing songs. In fact, everything turned out to be quite different. And during the time of camping, they managed to fight a lot. "Thank you very much." The dark-haired guy smiled broadly and held out his hand to Brandy. "We wouldn't have gotten the tent up without you." Fred, one of the girls, interrupted their conversation with a cranky voice. "Who's going to make the fire? What are we going to make it out of? We've forgotten how we forgot the firewood." The boy's face showed such panic that Brandy couldn't stand it and burst out laughing. "So we forgot," she shrugged. "What are we going to do now?" He looked around at his friends in confusion. By the look on their faces, they all shared his concerns. "What's wrong with you guys?" Brandy couldn't take it anymore. "Who comes into the woods for firewood anyway? Over there," she waved her hand toward the woods. "There's a huge ravine full of wood. You can get it from there." "What's the problem?" The boys looked at each other uncertainly and moved in the direction the girl had indicated. Brandy sat down on a large rock and began to carefully develop her sneakers. She was just finishing up when the grieving campers returned with firewood. They brought, of course, in her observation, utter nonsense. 2 of them had bundles of very thin twigs that burned in a few minutes. The third, the one who'd been talking to Brandy, was huffing and puffing and struggling to drag a huge old apricot, which was unlikely to have anything for the fire. "Guys, this isn't the same." She sighed, feeling like a kindergarten teacher. "Come on, I'll show you." With her guidance, they brought in and piled up wood suitable for the fire. Brandy herself brought in more than any of the boys. This, and this need chopping. She tossed aside several large pieces of wood. At the word chop, the young men looked at each other fearfully. "Let's get the axe." Brandy offered to help. "We'll take it from here, boys," she said, as the flames danced merrily over the wood stacked in the fire. The girls, who had been standing on the sidelines and ostentatiously looking at their manicures, rushed to thank their benefactor Brandy. "We'd be lost without you," the dark-haired guy said with a smile. Yeah, obviously it was coming to that. She nodded and slung her backpack behind her back. "Well, have a good vacation. And please, when you leave, take your trash with you." "Wait, you've been so helpful. We don't even know your name," the guy stalled. "My name is very plain and simple." Brandy, the girl, decided to make one last joke. Brandy, the boy, repeated in surprise, but to her surprise, he didn't say the usual stupid as in backwards. He said something original, you know. "It's no wonder you have such an unusual name. You're a remarkable girl yourself. You're like some kind of forest fairy." "We don't have fairies in our forest." She felt that she was enjoying talking to this guy. And yeah, he was pretty cute too. It's more Leslie. But you can't be Leslie's girl already, he smiled. I'm Leslie's granddaughter, she said jokingly. Emily, he said her name with pleasure. Perhaps you'd like to join us for dinner. It's the least we can do to thank you for your help. My name is Fred, by the way. She'd been wandering the woods all day and was certainly hungry. The prospect of eating fresh hot meat certainly appealed more than the dinner of canned gruel in her backpack. Fred's friends, realizing that, although their vacation had gotten off to a bad start, things had suddenly and magically gotten better, rushed over to invite Brandy to be their guest. She realized from their conversations around the fire that they came from the same city where she had studied, New York. They were students too, except for Fred, who was a little older and had already graduated. There were 2 couples in the company, and Fred had come alone. The usual majors, Brandy thought to herself as she looked at the large, obviously expensive SUVs, expensive brand-name clothes, and a lot of inappropriately selected items intended for outdoor activities. But in reality, in Brandy's opinion, they were a complete waste of money. It was clear from the guys' conversations, which mostly revolved around acquaintances and their financial opportunities, that the company's interests were quite specific and limited. Fred was the exception here. He tried to keep Brandy entertained and genuinely admired the fact that she could make witty jokes and act cute. Embarrassed himself for his touristy unfitness. Well, I guess I should get going, Emily said, looking at the setting sun and calculating the distance to the campground. Where to? Into the woods at night? Fred asked jokingly. No, thank you. I have to go. Brandy stood up resolutely and reached for her backpack. It was great to meet you. Have a good rest of the day, she shouted loudly to the whole group. Well then, at least let me walk you out. Fred also got up after the girl. I don't think that's a good idea, Brandy laughed. As I've already realized, you're not very good tourists, and I'm afraid that after you walk me out, I'll have to walk you back to camp, and then I'll be late. So bye, and good luck. She put on the straps of her backpack and took a step towards the woods. Wait, Brandy, please. Fred looked at her helplessly and pitifully. You mean you're just going to walk away and I'll never see you again? I wish I could. Brandy realized she was starting to flirt with him. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't help it. Do you like Fred? She asked. Yes, very much. He looked at Brandy with genuine admiration and smiled. Well, if you really want to, then you'll find me. All witches or wizards go to the Institute of International Relations. Didn't you know that? Brandy laughed, pleased with her joke, waved him off, and walked toward the woods, feeling his gaze on her back. And the shift at camp was over. Brandy returned to the city. A few days later, she started classes at the Institute, entering her 5th year. There were crucial sessions and work on her diploma ahead. It all came at once with such force that she almost forgot about her adventure in the woods and her acquaintance with a young man named Fred. She had been very surprised indeed when one day, as she walked down the stairs in the foyer, she saw his tall figure and dark hair. He waved at her and smiled. Hi, Brandy, he said as he approached, and she suddenly felt very pleased with the way he said her name. Fred said it softly, gently, carefully, as if he enjoyed saying it himself. So I found you. Why? She asked him bluntly. He was clearly embarrassed by such directness, blushed a little, and, stumbling a little, answered, Because I really wanted to. All this time since that meeting in the woods, I've been thinking about you all the time. I like you a lot, Brandy. And if it's possible, I'd like to take you out for, well, a walk, a chat. Okay, I'll do that, she replied simply. The Smith family was celebrating the 25th birthday of their only son, Fred. At the table, in addition to the birthday boy's father, Andrew, and Mom, Jane, sat several people who were considered close family friends. These people had been handpicked and vetted over the years. Jane carefully controlled her family's circle of acquaintances so that, God forbid, someone random and unsuitable would not be included. There was never any serious money in the family. Andrew, for many years, held a rather promising position as head of a small trucking company. In matters of personal enrichment, Jane was a complete profane. Jane Ivanovna herself, of course, had some opportunities, working as chief accountant of a small joint venture. But the money she earned by all means could not satisfy her appetite. There was only one hope for Fred. The boy grew up quite smart, handsome, and athletic. Jane struggled to provide her son with everything he needed. Since the 7th grade, by Jane's decision, he went to school with a claim to some elitism. This should, in the opinion of his mother, to provide a guy the right circle of socialization, which she dreamed of. By the end of school, it finally became clear that Fred had no special talents and abilities. With the right friends from the mother's point of view, too, there was a failure. Children of wealthy parents left for further studies in the capital and foreign colleges. Fred went to the most ordinary university, got a diploma in management, and went to work in some trading company as an ordinary employee with an ordinary salary. Of course, this was not at all what Jane had dreamed of for her son. Finally, 2 years after Fred graduated from the institute, hope flashed. Jane met a woman who turned out to be the wife of a very wealthy man. As Jane got closer to her new friend, she became convinced that her financial and property situation was really quite substantial. This was evidenced by the chauffeur-driven car in which Svetlana, as the acquaintance was called, drove around the city of New York. A huge, rather tasteless, but luxurious in terms of equipment and furnishings of the mansion, where Jane was soon invited to tea. But the greatest value of the new acquaintance in Jane Ivanovna's eyes was that Svetlana had a daughter. The maiden was a year and a half older than Fred, but looked all of 30 years old by nature. Not possessing anything outstanding, she was already fully acquainted with the achievements of plastic surgery. But in her case, unfortunately, it did not add much to her beauty. But the matter was not even in the natural data. The girl, whose name was Alina, was characterized by a bad character, to which her parents had a hand. She was spoiled, capricious, petty, and frankly stupid. Pick up such a treasure, despite the money of his father, willing to find yet not found. And the girl frankly gave her parents a lot of trouble and worry. Jane realized all this quite quickly just by getting acquainted and talking to Alina. Still, in her opinion, this was Fred's chance to make a name for himself, especially since both Aileen's father and mother were in favor and guaranteed the future young family all kinds of support. A meeting of the young people was arranged soon. Fred, from it, as expected, ran away at the first opportunity, and Alina was unexpectedly impressed by the dark-haired, tall, handsome man. After the guests were escorted out, Fred walked into the small kitchen where his parents were washing dishes. "Mom, Dad." Fred pulled a bottle of champagne from behind his back. "How about the three of us have a drink? We'll just sit and talk as a family." The parents nodded amicably, and in a few minutes the three were sitting around a small table. "Parents, my dears, I have big news for you." Fred raised his champagne glass solemnly. "I'm in love." "May I ask who?" The mother looked at her son carefully. "A girl, Mother, a girl." Fred laughed. "That's good," his father joked to lighten the mood a little. "Do you think it's funny?" Jane looked at her husband. "Well, what kind of a girl is she, may I ask?" "A lovely girl. Beautiful, intelligent, funny, completely unusual. All in all, the best qualities in the world. At least that's the way she seems to me." Fred was unusually enthusiastic. "I'm not interested in this girl's mental qualities. Not yet, anyway." "Who is she?" Jane looked at her son meaningfully. "Her name is Brandy, and she's a senior at the teacher's college. She wasn't born in this town, and she has parents, or rather her mom, because her dad died. Her mom is a perfectly normal person." Fred looked at his mother defiantly. "Okay, but it's clear to me. Are you out of your mind?" She jumped up and paced the kitchen excitedly. "So you're going to marry a penniless country girl with a stupid name and a teacher's diploma, who probably has a bunch of equally penniless alcoholic relatives?" Father looked reproachfully at his wife. "And you don't say anything at all?" she shouted. "This is the result of your upbringing. He does what he wants. Have you thought about me? You know I'm not allowed to worry with my heart." Jane has resorted to the unfortunate trick all mothers use. "Please calm down," Fred mumbled guiltily. "What about Lone? She called me just today, complaining that she couldn't get in touch with you. What do you think you're doing?" "Mom, I'm not interested in Alina. Remember that once and for all. You hear me? And Brandy? I proposed to her. We're getting married as soon as she graduates. You can take it or leave it, it's up to you. I'm sorry." Fred turned and walked out, but he could see his father applauding him without his wife noticing. Brandy and Fred had a modest wedding, attended by Piper and Aunt Jane on the bride's side. Jane Ivanovna sat through the festivities with an expression of grief on her face. After the wedding, the young people flew to New York, where they spent almost 2 weeks. They lived, of course, at Amber's, who received them with open arms. After returning from New York, Brandy and Fred settled in a small one-room apartment that Fred had gotten from his grandmother. A year later, they had a son named Anthony. Jane Ivanovna never came to terms with her son's choice and did not accept Brandy. Even the birth of an adorable, healthy grandson didn't soften her mood. "You ruined my son's life," she said flatly when she was finally alone with her daughter-in-law. "Don't think I'm going to let it go." Brandy's life had become a living hell. And worst of all, Fred, having quickly fallen back under his mother's influence, began to rapidly drift away from his wife after a couple of years. Jane constantly and methodically turned Fred against his wife. And scandals in the young family began to happen more and more often, and for any reason. "Hey Brandy, are you buying powder? Mom says it's completely useless and expensive. My mom was picking up potatoes from daycare yesterday. She says he's the worst dressed." Brandy: "Mom brought you some patties. She said you shouldn't buy store-bought anymore. They give me heartburn." "Listen, Fred." Brandy couldn't take it anymore. "If I hear you say the words Mom said one more time, I'm going to scream. I can't take it anymore, do you hear me? I feel like I'm not living with you and our son, but with your mother. She comes into our house without asking and goes through our stuff. Why don't we invite her into our bed? Don't you realize she's just manipulating us, and her only goal is to break us up? Don't you dare talk bad about my mother. If it weren't for her, we wouldn't even be able to pay for this apartment." "Yeah, I agree. Because you've been unemployed for 3 months. Go to hell," shouted Fred in a frenzy of anger. Brandy grabbed a thin bandage and ran out into the yard. When she returned half an hour later, she said, "Let's get a divorce." "Let's do it," Fred replied indifferently. Brandy and her son went to her grandfather's cozy old home, where they were welcomed without question or reproach. She finally went to work, as she had dreamed, in the very school her father had once built. And a year later, at the school assembly, she met a new school teacher named James. He was the man who had captured her heart once and for all. Seeing Anthony and Fred, Brandy never got in the way of seeing them and brought her son into town, regularly making arrangements with her ex-husband in advance. "Why are you home?" Jane Ivanovna looked with distaste at her son lying on the couch in the middle of the day. "Shouldn't you be with Anthony? Didn't they bring him to you?" "No, they didn't. Something happened there. I don't get it. Brandy's gone somewhere." Fred tried to sleep in his pillow. "What do you mean she's gone? Were you supposed to see the baby today?" Jane asked. "What does she think she's doing?" "I'm going to call her now and have her try to explain." Brandy's cell phone didn't answer, so Jane Smith dialed the long-distance code and the phone number at the Dabson house. "Hello," the voice on the phone was clearly a child's voice. "Hello," Jane Smith replied sternly. "Put Brandy on the phone for me." "Aunt Brandy isn't home. She flew to New York with Grandpa John and Aunt Piper. Her grandmother died there. I can't remember her name. It's a complicated name. She gave Aunt Brandy the same complicated word. Anyway, it's all Brandy there now." For all the rambling childish speech, the meaning of what was said was clear. This girl has someone in New York, and this someone bequeathed her something. Very interestingly, some vague memory touched Jane, but she clearly knew something, only she couldn't recall it. And that something was directly related to Brandy and what her connection to the capital was. "Fred, do you remember after your so-called wedding, you flew to New York and stayed with some relative of theirs?" She woke her dozing son and tugged demandingly at his sleeve. Even now, the woman didn't say Brandy's names out loud, her relatives' names, but made do with pronouns. So we lived." Fred shrugged. "Why do you want to know now?" "If I'm asking, I have to. Remember exactly where and with whom you lived. It's very important." "But I think it was Grandma Brandy's." "Yeah, that's right. I think she was her grandfather's sister, widow of some professor or academic. I don't really get it, but she's a worldly woman. She's very smart, and she loves her, you can tell. She even called her something affectionate. I don't remember how." "Oh, my girl. Where does she live?" "In an apartment." "Where's that?" Jane irritably interrogated her confused son. "The apartment is cool and big. You can't see the Kremlin, of course, but it's 3 minutes to the subway. And there's another 5 minutes and you're already in Times Square." The apartment is 5 minutes from Times Square. Jane even sat down for a minute because her legs wouldn't hold her. The widow of a New York professor or even an academic. How much could such an apartment be worth? $1 million? Or even tens of millions? Wow. Did Jane really pay off that girl? Well, it's still fixable. That country girl loves her fool, but Jane is no match for her. She's not to be trifled with. Sweetheart. My girl Jane sat across from Brandy in the small cafe she'd invited her to for a serious conversation. I'm sorry to you. It's just that things didn't work out right from the start. Probably because things with you and Fred happened too fast. It was a bit hectic, and I didn't realize it. When Anthony grows up, you'll know what it's like to have a girl take your son away from you. Jane pretended to be embarrassed. I'm a silly girl, dear, she continued after a dramatic pause. When you were separated, I realized how much Fred needed you. He would die without you. My girl, I beg you, come back to him. Because it can be fixed, and you'll be happy together. I'll be happy for you at last. Jane clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture. She was very much absorbed in her role as a generous, forgiving mother. And immersed in it all, she didn't look at Brandy. When she did, she finally lowered her arms and pulled herself up. In front of her sat a beautiful, confident young woman, looking at her with a sneer. Jane, darling, Brandy said, emphasizing the last word. You've been so kind to me that I'm at a bit of a loss. What's the matter with you? Are you well? I don't think so. I'm even embarrassed to take advantage of your momentary weakness. It was a complete defeat, but she could not allow the last word to go to anyone but herself. You got so cocky after you got a 4-bedroom apartment in New York with some old paintings on the walls, Jane hissed. Brandy chuckled. Well, I knew it. That's the reason for your sudden fervor for me. And by the way, your information is inaccurate. The apartment is really a 4-room apartment, and there are several paintings, and they are worth, at a conservative estimate, as much as the apartment, she said. What's the matter with you, Jane? You shouldn't have given up so soon. Brandy waved at a man entering the cafe. I'd like you to meet him. This is Andrew, my husband. We are, with your permission, leaning in. When you're in New York, give us a call. Brandy and her husband had long since left. Jane sat at the cafe table, tears rolling helplessly down the corners of her eyes. She finally wiped her eyes angrily, and as she stood up, she noticed a small piece of paper left on the table by Brandy. She picked it up and read a few words. Don't believe. Don't be afraid. Don't ask. Don't cry. Don't wait. Don't fuss. And don't hope. Emily was raised by her father, Joseph. She did not remember her mother and did not know what happened to her. Her father didn't like to talk about it and always left her in different ways. As time went on, Emily grew older. Here, just to get away from questions about her mother was no longer possible. On one of the next days, the 16-year-old girl rolled the most real scandal. Why don't you tell me what happened to Mom? Is she alive or not? Why do you avoid this topic every time? How many times can you do this? Emily paced from side to side, trying to calm herself down, but it was having no effect. Her father looked at her sympathetically, realizing that keeping quiet on the subject had become too hot in their small family. Why are you silent again? Where's my mother? Why didn't you ever tell me where she is? Maybe I want to visit her. I want to tell her what's going on in my life, even if she never hears me. Emily had long ago concluded that something had happened to her mom, and that was why her father was keeping her tragic fate quiet. Perhaps it really would have been better that way. However, there was not a shred of truth in the girl's speculation. Sighing heavily, Joseph walked over to his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder. He looked carefully into the girl's eyes, trying to calm her resentment a little. But it was to no avail. Who the hell are you to withhold information about my mother? And the one that carried me under her heart, that gave me this life. You have no right to withhold that information from me. Who is she? Where is she? Tell me something about her. Emily screamed with helplessness, with the pain and resentment that had been lurking in her soul for so long. Tears streamed down her cheeks, which she stubbornly ignored. Joseph's heart clenched unpleasantly as the picture unfolded, and he exhaled convulsively. And gathering all his will into a fist, he muttered, "Your mother just didn't want you. We found out late enough in the pregnancy that there was nothing we could do. She didn't want to have you, didn't want to become a mother, thought she was too young for it, and convinced me too that you didn't fit into our future. But even before you were born, I felt that you needed me, that you were the ray of hope for a bright future that I was not ready to give up. She could never love you, and right after you were born, she wrote a rejection letter. I begged her to think about it. I begged her to stay and be with you for a while. I assured her that she would love you, but your mother was adamant. She didn't want to spend time raising a child. She didn't want to wake up at night. She didn't want to change diapers. She didn't want to lose her beauty through constant sleep deprivation and stress. And she walked away, leaving you so tiny and defenseless alone in the hospital. His voice shook, and he stopped, deciding it wasn't worth continuing the story any further. Emily stared at her father in silence, trying to comprehend what she had just heard and make sense of her feelings. The only thing in Emily's girl's eyes was the question why. But that's not what she asked her father. And you didn't even try to find her, didn't try to show her what I've become independent and not requiring so much attention and care. Maybe she could have loved me, wanted to come back and start a family. Why didn't you try to make sure I had a mom like any other normal kid? Emily switched to shouting again, not holding back her resentment and negative emotions. She looked at her father with incomprehension, trying to understand why he was so calm, why he was not worried, telling about how he just gave up the chance to build a normal family. The man looked attentively at his daughter, giving her a chance to spill everything that had accumulated. Then, calmly answered, I tried. Gave her time to think about the decision and called only a few days after you were at home. But she didn't pick up that day, the next day, or the week after. She couldn't do that to me. She wouldn't leave me. She gave birth to me, carried me under her heart. Why doesn't she love me? Why do all mothers love their children, but mine abandon me? Joseph gently pulled his daughter close, trying to calm her. Tears were already streaming down Emily's cheeks. Sobs echoed every second. He felt he had started this conversation early. But would there be a good time when the story of a child abandoned by her mother wouldn't resonate with pain? I don't know, honey, I really don't. The only thing I do know is that I would never leave you. I would never hurt you like that. Would never let anyone take you away. The man fell silent, wondering whether to continue the story or drop the subject. After a few minutes of tense silence, he decided to continue so as not to return to the painful subject. I tried to tell her what a beautiful little princess you are. I sent her pictures of you, wrote messages, letters to her parents, but all in vain. After a couple years, she blocked me, changed her number. Her parents moved. I lost all contact and didn't know how to tell her about my growing angel. He stopped talking. Emily's shoulders shook with sobs. That was all he wanted to say, what she should have known about her birth mother. For several minutes, father and daughter stood in silence. Joseph was giving Emily time to realize the bitter truth. Gradually, she calmed down, her breathing evened out, but the trembling in her body remained. The girl looked into her father's eyes. But since it happened, since she gave up on us, why didn't you just set up a life with another woman? A lot of people do that. I wouldn't have known she wasn't my mother. How could I lie to you like that my whole life? If I told you that the woman you thought was your mother wasn't, wouldn't you look for your mother? Wouldn't you want to know why you have a stepmother? Would you forgive me? After this? Emily was silent. She had never before thought about how her father would have lived if he had had another woman. Would he have been happy with her, or would he have continued to blame himself for Emily's motherlessness? Would he have been able to never tell her that she was being raised by her stepmother? Or would she have found out when the time came anyway? The girl looked at her father carefully. There was no sadness in his eyes, no longing or any other feelings that expressed bitterness at the choice she had once made in favor of her own child. She gently put her arms around the man and spoke almost in a whisper. If you are happy, I will be happy. If you want to build a relationship, you want to be happy and loved, then I will be happy if in your life there will be a worthy woman who will be by your side both in sorrow and in joy. You have the right to do as you see fit. Emily smiled. Joseph couldn't see it, but he could feel it. He could hear it in the timbre of her voice, in the way she snuggled gently against him, and the breathy way she spoke of what she was thinking. The man had never considered that model of a future with someone other than his daughter. She had always occupied all his thoughts, all his feelings. He couldn't imagine bringing a strange woman into the house and telling his daughter to call her mom. But now Emily had grown up, matured, and realized that there must be room for love in everyone's life. Maybe she was right. Perhaps he really should think about finding a worthy woman with whom he could meet his old age. But had he known how such a wish would end, he would have thought several more times before making life unbearable not only for himself, but also for a completely innocent man whom his daughter simply could not accept. No matter how hard he tried to make it happen. Time passed. Emily had already forgotten about that conversation with her father, after which the man seriously thought about his lonely future. After the departure of his daughter to study, despite his inner resistance, he still decided to give himself the opportunity to be happy and began to actively search for a woman with whom he could get closer, so as not to meet old age alone. A couple more months passed. Emily continued to go to school, studying hard but acceptably. In the absence of constant supervision, the girl felt free and completely left to herself, and therefore did not worry about bad grades, failed tests, and scandals with teachers. But only until her father was called to the school. One weekday evening, Joseph's phone rang. The man picked up the phone, and then after a second he looked at his daughter with some displeasure and contempt in his gaze. The girl immediately understood everything and wanted to leave, but suddenly her father gestured for her to return to her seat. Emily exhaled convulsively and sank back into the chair, squeezing her head into her shoulders, and already realizing what was going to happen. "Yes, thank you, I understand," Joseph said into the phone. "I'll try to come in tomorrow at lunchtime and talk to the history teacher about my daughter's progress. Thank you for calling. Have a good day." The last words sounded like a sentence, and Emily knew that under the circumstances she couldn't avoid a serious conversation with her father. She looked at him carefully, hoping he would cool down and not lecture her. But he wouldn't. The man moved closer and started talking. "Do you realize that no one will need you without an education? What do you plan to do with your life? Work as a janitor or maybe a cleaner? Or do you want to find a rich husband who will provide for you and not put you in anything? You will live like a bird in a golden cage, where you will constantly close your mouth and point to your place. Is that the future you want for yourself or what you're trying to achieve?" Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. She didn't like these conversations with her father and didn't expect teachers or the principal to decide to contact her father to discuss her grades at all. The silence was becoming oppressive. She had to say something to avoid looking completely stupid. "I just don't see the point of this story. Why would I want to know what happened before I was born and what I can't influence? It's just unnecessary information that will never be useful to me. Or do you think we're going to have uprisings or presidents being overthrown again? We're in a completely different time. And all this history I'm learning has nothing to do with our lives. I don't need it." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully. For such a young age, the reasoning seemed serious but also childish. "You should learn history, at least so that I don't get called to school on my work days, and so that I don't have to blush, because you don't think a history teacher is an important teacher. But that's my opinion. You've always taught me to stand up for it, to always stand my ground, to always fight back. And now you're saying it's wrong. What do you expect me to do if you can't decide how I should behave? And now you're telling me I have 7 Fridays in a week." Emily jabbed her finger and rose quickly from her seat to avoid further conversation. However, her father held her hand. "My dear, you must understand the difference between standing up for your rights and violating the rights of others. Your rights end exactly where another person's rights begin, and you cannot violate them." The man let go of his daughter's hand, and the daughter, after staring at the gas station for a few seconds, abruptly turned around and went to her room. Joseph sighed heavily, anticipating not the most pleasant conversation with the teacher the next day, and not yet realizing that fate was preparing for him such a welcome and long-awaited gift. Barely free at lunchtime, Joseph hurriedly headed to school. Realizing that he didn't have much free time to spend talking to the teacher, it was easy to find the classroom. However, before he could even enter it, the man froze. Sitting at the teacher's desk was a young and attractive woman who looked completely lost in a classroom full of humming. It took a few seconds until Joseph was able to pull himself together and get out of his strange stupor, confidently entering the classroom and speaking menacingly. Everyone calmed down immediately. "Who taught you to behave like this in front of adults? Or some of you want to replace the teacher and tell a new topic on your own for a grade? Let's also call the principal to see how smart the students in this school are." The class was instantly completely silent. Not even the rustling of textbook pages or any of the other rustles that are so common in classrooms could be heard. The woman gratefully looked up at her savior, trying to figure out where she could see him. Good afternoon. I was asked to come in to talk to you about my daughter Emily's 8th grade performance, and she's been a little off her game lately. And yesterday the principal pointed out that she's been especially bad in history class. So I thought I'd come here to talk to you in person. The man smiled bewilderedly, realizing that his appearance was a lifeline for the teacher, and therefore there was hope in his soul that she would somehow change her mind about his daughter. But how could she not? The woman nodded slowly, looking around the class and giving the assignment they were to complete while she spoke to the student's father. The classroom continued to be completely silent even after the adults stepped out into the hallway, which was a great indicator of how Joseph's words had affected the overall atmosphere in the classroom. Do you understand? Your daughter Emily, she does not consider my subject important at all, and therefore she does not learn anything, does not want to answer in class, does not do her homework. I tried to explain to her that it is necessary to study the material at least in order to successfully graduate from school and enter the direction that will be interesting to her in the future. But these words had no effect on your girl, the teacher began. And already at this moment Joseph realized that the conversation would not be very pleasant. She behaves terribly in class, constantly distracts other students, and sometimes even does everything possible to disrupt the class. I reprimanded her, called the principal to the lessons, used disciplinary measures. However, there was no result. Therefore, I had no choice but to call you to the school for an educational conversation. You must influence your child, otherwise she will not finish school with a good average grade, and this will have a negative impact on her future. I hope you realize that this is serious. Joseph took a deep breath. He had certainly expected nothing good to be said about his daughter during this meeting, but he couldn't even imagine it being this bad. He looked at the teacher carefully and tried to squeeze out at least a semblance of a smile. I'll do everything I can to influence her, he said, but you know it's not as easy as it may seem. I'm always at work, doing everything I can to make a decent living for her, so I don't have enough time to raise her. The teacher blushed visibly, whether from the man's words about doing his best and her judging him, or from the strange feeling that was growing stronger in her soul by the minute, making her anxious and breathless. The silence became tense, and the woman made an effort to break it. Forgive me for an inappropriate question, and why the girl's mother does not participate in her upbringing. Does she also work all the time? Or maybe you have younger children, and she simply does not have time for an adult child, who in this case is left to himself. Just at this age, a girl needs a lot of attention from her mother. Practice shows that it is mothers who have the greatest influence on the unformed psyche of the child. So you talk to your spouse or invite her to school so that I can talk to her. Maybe it will give better results. Joseph's eyes showed a faint pain that hadn't left him in years. He'd always tried to be the best father he could be, investing all his energy and money in his daughter, giving her all his free time. But apparently it was not enough. He could not bring her up to be a decent person, instill a love of education and respect for elders. He could not replace her mother. The man raised his eyes to the teacher, who watched his reaction confusedly. And as hard as it was to admit, he dared to say the words that had been running through his mind for so long. We have no mother and no one to replace her. Perhaps it was because of me, because of my desire to become a father, because I did not support my beloved in her decision to give up the child. Perhaps I am to blame for the fact that Emily has become so spoiled I can't give her enough time to be around her all the time, to help her with her lessons and personal problems. Perhaps if she had a mother, if I had made more of an effort to find and keep her. If Joseph had been a little more persistent and confident back then, his little daughter Emily would have been a very different person. Perhaps there is some truth in what is happening now and in the words of others. Maybe he's just a bad father who couldn't handle raising his own child. That's all there is to it. Joseph faked a smile, trying to look confident and convincing, pretending that he wasn't hurt by his own words, that he had long ago come to terms with what had happened and knew he was failing as a parent. He stood still, looking at the drawings on the floor in the hallway, and suddenly felt the touch of a warm woman's hand. I'm sorry, I had no idea you had such a situation in your family, the woman said. I am sure that you are a wonderful father and you are doing everything you can to make your daughter happy. The teacher looked at the man warmly, trying to convey her sympathy. I didn't mean to hurt you or hurt you. Emily never said she didn't have a mom, or I wouldn't have brought it up. I'll try to be more sympathetic to her, and given the circumstances, I'll talk to the other teachers. We understand how hard it is for a girl to go through a difficult adolescence, albeit with the support of such a wonderful father." The woman raised her eyes to Joseph, who was looking at her with sincere gratitude. There was so much appreciation and warmth in his gaze that it made her uncomfortable, and she wanted to pull her hand away, but he intercepted it, pressing it to his chest. "Thank you so much. I am very grateful that you are willing to understand our situation and help my daughter with her studies. It's very valuable to us, and I'm sure Emily..." Felt her face flush. She had a strange, frightening, yet pleasant feeling for Joseph, and she wouldn't mind spending a little more time with him herself. Emily took the news that her teacher was coming to talk to her about her grades very badly. "I don't need strangers giving me advice on how to live my life," she resented her father as she watched her father prepare for the history teacher's arrival. The man wanted to make the best impression, so he even left work early to clean up the house and prepare something for dinner. He didn't seem to mind his daughter's outrage at all. Joseph was absorbed in his own thoughts. "Do you even hear me?" Emily almost shouted. "I do not want her to come to our house and tell us how to live properly, how to behave, and how to treat her. I don't need her guidance and advice. I can fix my own grades in school, Dad." Joseph perked up, realizing how deeply he had thought about their recent acquaintance. He seemed to have found the one person he was ready to spend his life with, someone who made him feel at ease, who truly understood and supported him. But is it appropriate to date his own daughter's teacher? Does she have a husband or a young man? And most importantly, how will Emily react to the news that her father has fallen in love with the teacher, whom the girl, it turns out, sincerely hates? A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was Mary. As promised, the woman looked just fine, not at all reminiscent of the teacher the man had seen during the day at school. Her makeup, beautiful dress, and confident gait made her different from the hunted mouse he'd encountered. But that only added a fire to his gaze and made his new acquaintance even more attractive and alluring. "Good evening, Mary. You're looking very well. It's good to see you." "Good evening. It's nice to see you again, Joseph." Emily looked out of the living room, wondering what was going on in the other room, and since when her father had become so polite and courteous to women. But when the woman saw the girl looking intently in their direction, she immediately returned the businesslike tone and serious look she always used at school. "I hope Emily knows what I'm here for, and that she and I are going to have a serious conversation. You warned her about this, didn't you?" "Of course I did. Emily's waiting for you in the living room. She knows what you've come for." Mary, as if ignoring the confusion on the man's face, went into the room where Emily was waiting for her. The girl was sitting on the sofa, making it clear that she was not happy about the situation and had no plans to talk to her teacher. Mary looked at her carefully and said, "Hi, Emily. Your father, Joseph, is a little worried about your performance in school. I know you're a smart girl, but lately your grades have been slipping. Why don't we talk about what's going on? Look, studying is an important part of life. It helps you decide your future career, develops your thinking skills and self-discipline. I want to help you, but to do that, I need to understand what's wrong. Maybe you find it difficult to learn the material or lack motivation. We'll figure it out together. Emily, you're an amazing girl with a lot of potential. I can see you trying, but something is keeping you from performing at your best. Let's find a solution that will help you learn the program and get you back on track. I will be there for you and will do my best to support you. Joseph is worried because he's worried about your future. He wants you to have lots of opportunities and prospects after school. But this is your life, and you will choose your own path. Our job is to help you go after your goals with ease and confidence." Emily looked at Mary, her teacher. She could see irritation in her eyes. Nevertheless, she decided to answer. "Mary, you are very nice trying to support me. But I know exactly what you're talking about. My studies, my future, my goals, they're all important. However, at the moment, I just don't have the desire to make the effort. Maybe that will change later, but right now I'm not interested in cramming textbooks and writing tests. So unless you have any more new information or advice, we have nothing to talk about." Emily said it in a haughty tone, as if challenging her teacher. Joseph, who was in the next room, was upset at his daughter's behavior. Joseph was worried about Emily and wanted her future to be secure. He wanted Emily to grow up to be a decent, independent person, able to stand up for herself, provide for herself, and not need anything. His admonitions are attempts to help guide her on the right path. "I don't need your advice. I know how to live my own life," Emily said. "Stop telling me how to behave, what decisions to make, who to talk to. I'm an independent adult who can make decisions that affect my future. Stop telling me what to do." "Emily, look, no one is prying into your life. We're trying to help you, to keep you from making serious mistakes that could negatively affect her. You see, we're not telling you what to do or how to do it. We're telling you, guiding you, helping you figure out how to do better." Mary put her soul into every word, trying to be tactful and pleasant, so that Emily understood the essence and stopped resisting, began to learn. But the result was the opposite. Emily looked at the teacher unhappily and spoke haughtily. "Tell those who need your advice about how to live better. I don't need them at all, and I'm sure that I can organize my life without your interference. Thank you for coming, but I don't intend to talk to you anymore. My friends are waiting for me. Have a good day." Without waiting for a reply, Emily stood up and headed for the exit. The door slammed. Joseph jumped up and walked quickly into the living room, expecting that it was his daughter's teacher who had left, not her. Looking confused at the obviously upset Mary, he sat down next to her and spoke quietly. "She's always been temperamental and explosive, and this has nothing to do with you. She's hard to please. She does things her own way. Do not take her behavior to heart. It has nothing to do with you." Joseph noticed the warmth and appreciation in Mary's eyes and, looking away, continued. "Thank you for trying to talk to her. It may not have been successful, but I'm sure she appreciated your attempt to help. But the important thing is that I at least tried to help you," Mary admitted suddenly, smiling softly. Joseph quickly looked at her in surprise. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to influence your daughter. I'm sure she and I can still find common ground. She's not what she wants to be. She is very vulnerable inside and hides it behind a mask of detachment." Joseph smiled at Mary and gently touched her hand. "I am very grateful that you were able to make time for my child. I understand that you have a lot of things to do and worry about. This is very important to me, and I must admit I was very glad when you came to visit us. I made dinner, by the way. It's not a work of art, of course, but I'd be delighted if you'd stay and try it." Mary agreed. The couple felt the attraction, but in a way they tried to hide it, to suppress the strange feelings growing inside, preventing them from thinking straight. But no matter how people fight fate, they still find themselves subject to feelings and desires. Joseph and Mary are no exception. The relationship between them spiraled rapidly. After a couple of weeks, Mary began to visit her new suitor more often and even stay overnight on weekends. Emily immediately noticed the change in her father's behavior. And at first she was even happy for him, but only until she found out with whom her father was building a relationship, and she wasn't going to accept his choice. "What's this all about?" Emily grudgingly asked her father during breakfast. "What is she doing in our house? Why is she even here?" Joseph looked at his daughter with incomprehension and spoke calmly. "You yourself wanted me to find a woman with whom I would spend my free time and with whom I would like to meet old age. And I found one. I began to control you less, give a lot of time to myself and my interests, and you became a fully independent person who makes his own decisions, without the constant nagging from me. What's wrong? Why aren't you happy with the choices I've made?" "Because it's not a choice," she said. "You just decided to start a relationship with my teacher so that she would do me favors at school. You decided that this way you could help me improve my grades. Well, I don't need that kind of help from you. Just know that. And you better stop this before it goes too far. Otherwise, you will regret it later. And it will be too late to change anything. The girl said grudgingly, watching her father's facial expressions carefully. And what makes you think that I decided to start a relationship with Mary for the sake of your studies? Joseph asked. How so? It's plain and simple. I was having trouble with this particular subject. I refused to accept help from her the last time she came to our house. And you thought you could improve my grades just like that. If you started a relationship with it, she waved her hand toward the bedroom. She waved her hand toward the bedroom where the woman remained, unable to find a decent word. You decided to start a relationship with her to improve my grades. But I don't need that kind of sacrifice. Thank you very much. So, Daddy, you can dump her and live peacefully to yourself without this connection. Joseph listened attentively to his daughter, realizing that she really believed everything that was said, and did not accept the possibility that he could just fall in love with his own daughter's teacher. Several tense minutes passed until he decided to tell Emily the truth. Sweetheart, this has nothing to do with you, he said softly. I realized that you didn't want control and that you were going to make all your own decisions. I realized that last time. So I left you alone. Gave you the freedom to take charge of your own life and make the decisions that would affect it in one way or another. I'm honestly not even sure I was doing the right thing before, trying to control you all the time. And now you have the opportunity to really make all the decisions yourself, to make the choices that will affect your life, without being constantly controlled by me or your history teacher. The man hesitated, trying to find the right words. What about Mary? I love her very much indeed, and I want to build a happy relationship with her. They have nothing to do with you. No one's making any sacrifices to get you good grades and a happy future. I just realized at one point that I really like this woman, and apparently she feels the same way about me. Joseph smiled dreamily, already imagining a happy future with his chosen one, not paying attention to his daughter's unhappy grimace. Suddenly, Emily slammed her fist on the table, looking at her father with displeasure and saying through her teeth, "When I told you that I'd be happy if you found the woman you'd like to grow old with, I didn't mean that you should fall in love with my teacher, who would make my life at school simply unbearable." You can't just start a relationship with her like that, Emily said grudgingly. Everyone would know about it. What would happen then? What would they say about you? Joseph shrugged his shoulders, expressing complete incomprehension of his daughter's displeasure. What will they say about me? We're all adults and we understand that people fall in love, he replied. I've spent my life raising you, giving you everything you could ever dream of. And now I want to feel happy and loved. I want to be with a woman who really loves me. I want to grow old with her. I want to spend every day at work, knowing that I will be waiting for me at home with a hot dinner. You see, I have the right to be happy too, no matter how old I am. Emily's gaze grew heavy. She looked at her dreamy father with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. Emily looked at Joseph with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. She hadn't expected him to find a woman so quickly. Emily had thought that he would have his personal life already after she left to study, and he was alone. Did he lack love and care from his daughter? Had he been unhappy spending time with her before? Was everything he said really true? But then why did it hurt so much inside? Why did every word he said make her so uncomfortable? Emily slowly leaned toward her father, leaving about 10 centimeters between their faces, and gritted through her teeth. I'm sorry that you weren't happy because of me, and couldn't build the life you dreamed of because you had to take care of your daughter. Perhaps it would have been better if you had just given up on me. I would have gone to people who loved me instead of thinking of me as a burden. Emily abruptly pulled away from her father and headed for the exit. On the way, she bumped into her history teacher, Mrs. Mary. The woman smiled. Good morning, Emily. I hope you remember that there's a history test tomorrow. Prepare well to pass it the first time. Mary wanted to touch the girl, but she took a step to the side, not allowing her to touch. Emily looked at the teacher with hatred. I used to dislike only your subject, but now I sincerely hate you too. I hope you are happy with ruining my life. The girl quickly walked out, ignoring the teacher's incomprehensible look and her father's heavy sigh from the kitchen. She was so hurt, lonely and sad. She didn't think her own father would trade her for a woman he didn't know, be happy with her over his daughter, and choose her in the end. tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet paths, everything squeezed inside. There seemed to be almost no air left in her lungs. The world was fading and becoming unreal. She walked on, not caring what road she traveled, just to get away from the house, not to see her father's happy face, and the one that had taken him away from his daughter. Emily didn't know how much time had passed, but when she came to, it was already dark. Looking around, the girl realized she was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. The fear inside made everything tighten. There was no one around to ask for directions. The phone was left at home. There was no money for a cab either. What to do? Where to go? After thinking for a while, Emily decided to walk in the opposite direction, hoping that on the way she would remember where she had come from. Emily felt herself getting more confused with each new turn. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but now from helplessness and powerlessness. She didn't know where to go, she didn't know where she was or what would happen to her, and most importantly, whether anyone was even looking for her, or whether her father was only glad that such a burden as she was finally gone from his life. Inside, everything was shrinking from fear and not understanding what would happen next. It became scary to turn somewhere, to go in an unknown direction. There were sounds around, from which the girl shuddered every time. Complete darkness began to press on the psyche. The heart beat faster. It seemed that it was pounding so hard that it could break the chest. Suddenly, the girl heard some voices behind her back and turned around to see who had come outside to ask for help. There was a group of guys standing in the distance, talking loudly about something. They didn't see Emily, and so she decided to approach them herself to find out where she was and where she should go to get to the right street. But the decision made in fear and panic was not the best one, and Emily soon realized it. But it was too late. Approaching the company of guys, the girl felt a strange anxiety, which was different from the fear she had before. It seemed that getting too close was not the best decision. However, the guys had already noticed her, and were watching carefully as the frightened and completely lost girl slowly approached them. A grin appeared on the face of one of the guys, which obviously didn't bode well. But Emily still dared to ask. "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Lincoln Street?" Emily stopped a few meters away, asking her question loud enough to be heard clearly in the company of the guys. Even so, no one was in a hurry to answer. One of the guys took a step closer to the girl, followed by a second and a third. They stopped just a couple dozen centimeters away from her. One examined Emily closely, and his smile only grew wider. Leaning over to her, he muttered, "What's a little girl like that doing alone? Baby time is long over at night outside, and you should be in your little crib." All the guys started laughing with glee, which made everything inside the girl feel as if she had fallen. She felt fear and excitement, realizing that it would not be possible to get rid of the attention so easily. But the main thing was to know where to go and not to provoke the guys. There were strange lights in the eyes of some of the strangers that only made Emily more nervous. It took a few dozen seconds before she was able to squeeze out a few words. "I was just taking a walk and got lost. And now I don't know how to get home." She had hoped that such a childish confession would make the boys realize that she was just a child with nothing to take from them. But it seemed that this manner of speaking only served to irritate the boys. One of them came very close to the girl and touched her shoulder. "How nice we are," he said. "You can't tell from the looks of us. You know, I especially like girls who are obedient, who will do whatever you tell them to do and don't ask questions. You're like that, aren't you?" The boy looked into Emily's eyes, and she could see the evil lights dancing in his gaze. She wanted to run, but it was too soon. And where would she go if she didn't know how to get home? And running, not knowing where to go, wasn't the best solution. She'd be exhausted too quickly, and this group of guys would easily catch up with her. So we have to somehow turn the situation around so that they tell her where to go, and only then start running. "I'm sorry, but I just want to go home. My dad's waiting for me there. He must be very worried about me," Emily said in a shaky voice. Emily walked down the unfamiliar street. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Excuse me, can you tell me where to go? This is my first time here." Two guys approached her closely. One of them ran his fingertips through her hair. Emily felt an uncomfortable sensation but stayed where she was, trying not to provoke them. "If you behave and do everything we say, we'll walk you home ourselves afterwards so no one else can touch you," the other guy smirked. "But only if you're good, and if you get cranky." He lowered his voice deliberately, giving it an ominous tone. Emily realized she couldn't expect any help from these guys. She thought feverishly about what she should do. She couldn't think of a single sensible way to hide or get away from a group of tough guys who clearly looked stronger and tougher than she was. Her heart was pounding faster and faster, blood pounding in her temples. "So, will you behave yourself?" The other guy asked again, continuing to stroke her hair. "Or do you want to play naughty girl and get punished?" He leaned very close to her ear. "Hey, stop messing with her," shouted irritably the third guy in the crowd. "Let's get out of here. How long can we stand here? We're attracting too much attention." He moved toward Emily with determination. Realizing that there might not be another chance, she ran down the street, not looking back and trying to ignore her racing heart. A second's hesitation from the boys gave her a small head start, but soon she heard them catching up to her quickly. Emily realized what would happen if they caught her. She ran as hard as she could, feeling her legs jacking up. Turning corners, winding streets, her eyes were already swimming in multicolored circles from lack of air. The realization came that there was no escape. And then Emily bumped into someone on the sidewalk. She lost consciousness, but felt someone's strong arms pick her up. The next thing she knew, it was darkness, no thought, no feeling. When Emily regained consciousness, there was light all around. She was lying on a pillow, her body aching unpleasantly, reminding her of her recent adventures. Her throat was dry. Her eyes ached from the tears shed last night. Looking around, the girl realized she was in a hospital room and tried to raise herself, but she felt dizzy and weak. Slowly lowering herself back onto the bed, she decided to wait for someone to come and explain the situation. Suddenly, Emily noticed a rustle to her left and was startled to see the boy sleeping peacefully in the chair. Her insides clenched with fear. Had she been caught after all? Had they done something to her? And now someone from that company was sitting next to her, so that she wouldn't say anything unnecessary? Tears came to her eyes, and the girl decided to leave the room and find a doctor on her own. But when she tried to get out of bed, the guy woke up. He looked carefully at Emily and, smiling slightly in a sleepy voice, said, "I'm glad you've come to your senses." The doctor said that Emily had just had a lot of exhaustion and excitement happen to her, but the guy was still worried that those bullies might have done something to her. The doctors didn't want to leave him, but since Emily's cell phone was dead and she had fallen into his arms, he was allowed to stay and monitor her condition until her parents arrived, who were due to arrive soon. In the meantime, he would guard her sleep as best he could. The guy smiled again, and that smile somehow made him feel much calmer. "So you're not one of those guys who chased me so hard?" Emily asked tiredly, slowly lowering herself back onto the bed and closing her eyes. "I was already scared that you were with them and sitting next to me to keep me from saying too much or convincing me that everything was my wish." Emily exhaled convulsively, trying to catch her breath. "Don't worry, it's okay," Joseph replied. "They've all been detained until the circumstances are clarified. They tried to prove to me that they hadn't touched you, but I didn't believe them. Now let them think about their behavior behind bars, at least until you testify." The boy moved a little closer to Emily, peering gently into her tired and frightened eyes. "Didn't your parents teach you that it was dangerous to walk alone on dark streets at this hour? What if I hadn't been around the corner? What if they'd caught up with you before you could get to me? Do you even think about the consequences of your decisions?" Emily felt herself blush thickly. She didn't want to be lectured by a complete stranger. But there was truth in his words, and she decided to tell him everything that had happened that night so that she wouldn't seem frivolous. The boy listened to her attentively, and then, with a sigh, spoke. "Yes, I understand you perfectly well. I myself had such things, misunderstanding from parents, quarrels and scandals. But you know, once my history teacher gave me a really good advice that changed my life. You know what she said? That no matter what emotions reign in my soul, no matter how much I want to leave, to stop communicating with my parents and get rid of their overly intrusive care, they are still my parents, who gave me life and sacrificed a lot to provide for me, to bring me up and give me a chance for a normal life. That's why I should treat them with respect, tolerate their quirks, just as they once tolerated my childish whims and tears. Of course, I couldn't fully accept their behavior and forget their mistakes. But you know, I think that advice did help me to be easier on them, to make concessions and to forgive some things." Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. Another piece of advice, another admonition, another attempt to pry into her life that she was so sick of. She sighed heavily, looked at the guy carefully and mouthed, "Thank you so much for saving me tonight." but I'll figure out how to live my life on my own. I don't need your advice and guidance. I'm sorry. I'd like to learn from my mistakes. Okay? No, you've got it all wrong, he smiled. I was just sharing my life experience with you. I didn't want to teach you how to live or change your views and attitudes. I just told you how I see the situation, that's all. He went back into his thoughts. I just realized I should have been closer to my mother. It was too late. At a time when I had no way to get close to her, or just have a heart-to-heart talk with her. Some mistakes teach valuable lessons, but the toll they take on our lives is too high. A few seconds later, there was a rustle in the hallway, and Emily's worried father came running into the room. He seemed to have aged considerably in just one night, and even changed in his face. The girl watched with incomprehension and some sympathy as his gaze frantically traveled over her, and then stopped on the boy who had remained close by. Joseph rushed to embrace his daughter, pulling her gently against him. Tears were rolling down the man's cheeks, and it looked so unusual that the girl was finally confused and froze in indecision, not understanding what to do and how to behave. She gently pulled away from her father, looking into his eyes and asking in all seriousness, "What's the matter with you? I've come home late before and stayed overnight at a friend's house without permission. And you've never been so worried?" "I always knew where you were and what was wrong with you," the man's voice trembled, and that made her feel even more uncomfortable. "And this time it seemed to me that something terrible had happened, that you would never come home." She was not used to seeing her father in such a state, not used to seeing him weak and depressed, and so everything inside clenched unpleasantly at the unfolding picture. She turned to the boy, who was watching father and daughter closely, and sighed. "Admittedly, I did get myself into a bit of a mess. But thanks to this young man," Emily pointed to the boy beside her bed, "it's all over, and I'm safe and sound now. I'm lucky I met him on the street, or I'm afraid to imagine what might have happened." She was silent, realizing that it was better for her father not to know the whole story, especially given the state he was in. Joseph immediately turned to the stranger and began to hug him. "Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking care of my daughter. She's such an impulsive but good girl. She's very lucky to have such a compassionate young man. I'm afraid to even imagine what could have happened if she had met one of those criminals that frequent the streets at night. There has been so much bad news already." The boy noticed the pain flashing in Joseph's eyes, and turning back to Emily, he noticed the pleading in her eyes. And it all became clear. He made the decision to keep quiet about everything that had happened as well. To calm the man down and not to complicate the life of the rescued girl, gently pulling away from the man's strong embrace, the guy adjusted his clothes and spoke in a calm voice. "You know, I think that's what anyone in my place would do. Leaving such a beautiful girl in trouble is not gentlemanly. So I couldn't do anything else. Besides, I didn't do anything wrong. I just brought her to the hospital after she passed out in the street." Noticing the anxiety, if not horror, in Joseph's eyes, the guy immediately hurried to continue. "But the doctors said she was just exhausted, and that's the only reason she passed out. She's completely fine. They'll take some tests in a couple of hours, and if everything is fine, they'll let her go home." He smiled, trying to make his words positive and convincing. But there was still anxiety in Joseph's gaze. He looked at his watch and then at his daughter and spoke. "I have to report to work now. I have a promotion coming up that will pay for my princess's education, and I can't miss it. But as soon as you get all your tests done and are told you can go home, I'll come right over to pick you up. Okay, sweetie? Or, if you want, I can ask Mary to meet you." "No," Emily answered firmly, not even wanting to hear her father's suggestion. "I'll get home on my own, and I'm not going to let your Mary meet me. I don't need her help. She's the reason I left home. She's the reason everything happened. And you don't understand that, and you stubbornly don't see it," she said resentfully, folding her arms across her chest and turning away from her father, clearly showing that she didn't want to continue the conversation. Joseph sighed heavily, trying to understand how to please his daughter and keep his own happiness. At that moment, the stranger spoke. "You know, I'm on the car. Today I have the day off so I can take your daughter home myself after the doctors say that she is fine. Then you won't have to take off work and risk a promotion, and your beautiful daughter won't have to make concessions to be met by someone else." The guy smiled, waiting for an answer. "Of course, if you don't mind." Joseph looked at Emily carefully. Even in this situation, she was still cold and distant, and it bothered him a lot. After a few minutes, the man made his decision. Fine. But if she doesn't want to go with you, just call me and I'll call a cab or come myself. It was nice to meet you." Joseph fell silent, realizing he didn't recognize the name of his daughter's savior. "Brian. It's nice to meet you too. I hope this isn't the last time we see each other." "It's nice to see such loving fathers," the boy smiled, extended his hand, and Joseph shook it in return, then walked briskly out of the room. "I can get home on my own. I don't need your help," she said almost in a whisper, despite Brian's presence. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." The boy moved closer. At that moment, Emily felt her heart beat faster. "I'm telling you, I'm capable of getting home on my own," she said louder, deliberately moving away from her savior. "I don't need anyone's help or handouts. Thank you. But it seemed like you couldn't have gotten home on your own last night. Plus, your cell phone is still dead, and the hospital doesn't have a charger. How were you going to get home?" The guy reacted unhappily. "And you don't have money for a cab." Emily realized that she was in a desperate situation and would have to ask her nighttime savior for help anyway. "Okay," she muttered. There was a pause for a few minutes, in which everyone was thinking about something else, until the girl made up her mind. "Thank you for saving me. I'm afraid to imagine how things would have ended that night if you hadn't been there. Probably nothing good." "You're welcome," the boy replied simply and sincerely, looking into the eyes of the saved girl. "I couldn't leave such a beautiful girl alone. It was good that I went outside at that very time. It was like something was beckoning me to stand there. Fate, I guess." The girl was embarrassed by what she heard and hurried to look away, so as not to see the guy's smile, which gave her a wave of goosebumps inside. Brian, on the other hand, watched the girl's reaction carefully, trying not to miss anything and admiring the one that saw his soul. Emily was indeed discharged home. The tests were normal. However, the girl was advised not to overexert herself. She was released from classes for the next few days and recommended to undergo a full examination to find out the cause of fainting. As promised, Brian drove the girl home. Emily took her time getting out of his car, scrutinizing the guy. After a few minutes of silence, he asked, "Do you want me to walk you straight to the door, or can you walk yourself?" "I can do it myself," she replied. "Thank you for coming to my rescue and driving me home, despite my unbearable temper. And thank you for just being there for me the whole time. It was very important to me." Emily slowly leaned over to the guy and kissed him gently on the cheek. The warm touch of her lips sent shivers down Brian's body, and at that moment he realized that next to him was not just an accidentally rescued girl, but the one given to him by fate. The guy took Emily's number, and from that moment the couple's communication spiraled rapidly. After a couple of months, Brian offered the girl to meet, and she agreed. The relationships with him became a kind of outlet, which helped to distract from the constant reflections on his father and his new passport. Toward the end of the school year, Joseph decided to make Mary a proposal, so that in the summer to play a modest wedding and legalize their relationship. And that was the last straw in Emily's patience. She did not intend to watch her father build a life with the one she hated so much. And so the girl made a sharp, in her opinion, the only right decision to move out, and to tell her father about it she decided to immediately. "What are you leaving after the 9th grade?" Joseph said with displeasure, pacing from corner to corner in the living room and trying to calm down, so as not to say too much to his daughter. "What about higher education? What about the prospects you've been striving for all these years? Are you really just ready to give up everything because of another whim?" And at that moment Mary came to him, who gently took his hand and looked into his eyes and gently said, "Let her make her own decision. She is an adult and can be responsible for her actions. We all learn from our mistakes. Maybe this will be a great lesson for her on how not to act in a situation, or maybe she will actually get what she wants out of life." Joseph exhaled convulsively. He wasn't ready to make that kind of decision from his daughter, and so the idea that it might be the right one seemed somehow unrealistic. Still, he decided to listen to his chosen one and closed his eyes and spoke. "Maybe you're right, and Emily really just needs more freedom. I just wanted to say that her decision seems wrong to me, and that I think it will lead to a completely different outcome than she expects. That's all. I didn't forbid her from making her own decision, nor did I say that she should give up her aspirations to please me. I'm just trying to keep her safe." "I understand," darling Mary said softly, looking into Joseph's eyes. "But she's a big girl, and she can decide for herself how to be, how to behave, how to act in any given situation. She's not a little child, after all." The man sank down in his chair. He realized that it was really true, that it was time to give his daughter the opportunity to make her own decisions and dispose of her life as she saw fit. But the anxiety and worry wouldn't let him go. He looked up at his daughter, and only at that moment did he notice the unkind grin on her face. And in the next second, Emily spoke with displeasure and anger. Of course, who'd have doubted she'd say that? I've always been a bone in her throat. And now that she's had a chance to get rid of me early, she's not going to miss it. Still, I made the right decision when I realized it was time to move out. Otherwise, I would have had to endure 2 more years of a disgruntled look on my face and some stupid accusations against me. Emily forgot to put her shirt back on, or didn't wash her plate, or behaved inappropriately in front of guests. She thought that then a calm and measured life would come. As soon as I get kicked out of my own house, right resentment and dissatisfaction with the situation could be heard in Emily's voice. It was clear that the girl was not thrilled with the decision, but thought it was the right one. Confused by his daughter's words, Joseph muttered, "What does Mary have to do with it, if you yourself decided to move out after 9th grade? It's your decision, no one imposed it. Why, when Mary supported it, do you think she wants to evict you? I don't understand anything." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully, hoping she would realize the error of her ways. But Emily became even more disgruntled. "Of course you never see what's wrong," she glanced obliquely at Mary, who looked incomprehensively back and forth at her future husband and Emily, not knowing whether to intervene or remain silent. Joseph rose slowly and approached his daughter. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he looked into her eyes. "Sweetheart, why do you always have some strange competition with the woman I truly love? She hasn't replaced you for me. She hasn't become the only one I love. She has no prejudice against you. Contrary to your speculation, she's trying to connect with you, to get closer, and you're pushing her away. She's not replacing your mother, and she never intended to. But can't you have a warm relationship for my sake?" The man looked at his daughter with hope and tenderness, but her gaze became hard and displeased. "You knew from the beginning that I didn't approve of your association with my teacher. What made you think I would be thrilled to marry her? It's your decision, not mine. I don't have to support it. I'm sure she's only with you because of the house and work. Not the love you're talking about. You can see it in her." Mary sighed heavily, realizing that building a good relationship with Emily would be difficult, but she had no idea how much. Joseph replied calmly, "You're right, it's my choice and it's not your place to judge it. It's not like I'm judging your Brian and I'm trying to build a good relationship with him, because he didn't interfere with our family, try to take me away from you, or tell me how to live my life. Since you're so happy with her, you should know that you lost me because you chose her." Her Emily shouted to her father through gritted teeth. She raised her head proudly and went to her room, hoping that the conversation would influence her father's decision to marry Mary. But it didn't, and the girl decided to move away from her father as soon as she received her diploma. Emily entered college in another city and from the first days lived with Brian. He rented an apartment, paid for groceries and expenses. While the girl was studying, Brian loved her unconsciously and was willing to do anything to make her happy and stay close to her. Despite her father's protests that it was too early for Emily to live with a boyfriend, she did her own way, as always. Joseph soon reconciled, taking Brian's promise that his daughter Emily would definitely get an education and only after that become a happy mom and wife. And boy did he promise that he would. Mary and Joseph played a wedding, to which Emily decided not to come. She did not want to be present at that celebration, which she absolutely did not approve of. But Brian was not in favor of such a decision. "Why don't you want to be there for your father on such an important day?" he said. "I think he'd like it if you could come, especially since the wedding is in the summer, before school starts, which is very convenient for you. They made sure you could get to their celebration without missing school." The guy watched with incomprehension as the girl tore the wedding invitations into small pieces, sitting on the living room floor. "I won't go where I'm not welcome," Emily replied. "And I wouldn't be welcome there, believe me." "But why do you think that? They sent you an invitation, and they took the time and effort to make it and sign it. They even invited you to come early to help organize the party. This is one of the most important days of your father's life. That's right, in his life, he made the decision to marry that witch. Despite the fact that I hate her, despite our terrible relationship, despite the fact that she treated me abominably and told me how to live my life, what to do, what to wear, despite the fact that I am an adult, an independent person. And she is the reason that our relationship with my father, which he spent so long building and cherishing, has shattered. I don't want to see him choose her over me. I don't want to see him give up our good relationship for someone who only values a spacious house and a big wallet. Emily closed her eyes and sighed heavily, trying to calm down and get her thoughts in order. She didn't want to think anymore about the fact that her father had chosen some other woman over her, that he had made her the center of his life, and that he had made the decision to marry in spite of her displeasure. But Brian kept asking questions, trying to figure out exactly what had happened and why Emily had this attitude toward her future stepmother. But she didn't do anything bad to you, right? She just fell in love. She didn't fall in love, Emily cut her off. She came into someone else's family and made her own rules that I had to follow. And my father, like a blind sheep, didn't want to see her leading him around and making him a tosser. Well, maybe he was just really in love with her, Brian suggested. He wanted to do everything he could to make her happy. I love you very much too, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that you don't need anything and can live the life you want. I always fulfill your requests. Emily looked at him unhappily. She didn't want to continue this conversation, and she certainly didn't want to waste her time explaining to him the problem and the reasons for his bad attitude. Just trust me. She's not at all who she says she is, the girl said. She's a disgusting, mercenary woman who will do anything to keep my father on a leash and bounce around on her hind legs. I know exactly what she's trying to accomplish, and she got it in the end. I tried to save him from this mistake. I tried to show him that he became just a slave who does not know anything and cannot distinguish lies from the truth. But he didn't listen to me. He made the choice she whispered to him. Let him suffer now. Brian was silent, realizing that the conversation would not lead to any expected result, and therefore there was no point in continuing it. Emily had almost completely stopped communicating with her father. She rarely returned his calls, hardly ever read his messages, and stopped coming home completely. She still considered him a traitor, didn't want to accept his decisions, and couldn't let go of the resentment that sat in her soul. Emily finished her studies and started working in her profession. 6 months later, Brian proposed to her. She accepted. It was decided to just sign, not to make a lavish wedding, and just spend the day for themselves. That's how it all worked out. They began to live together, to build their family life, and therefore there was no time to worry about her father and his new wife. Emily was completely immersed in her life, not yet realizing what a surprise awaits her from fate. One weekend, Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw Mary's name. Goosebumps ran down her body. Her stepmother was calling her, and she was the last person she expected to call. The girl blocked the screen, not wanting to pick up the phone, realizing that she wouldn't hear anything good. Suddenly, Brian's voice sounded. "Who's calling you on your day off? Is it work again? Is there a problem?" "No, my stepmother has decided to ruin my life by showing up again," Emily answered. "It's been so long, and she can't stand the fact that I don't want to be around their family. I'm sick of it." "Well, maybe something's wrong. She's not just calling. Pick up the phone, at least to see what they want you to do." The guy looked out from behind the corner, looking carefully at the girl, who stood near the phone with a disgruntled expression. "You just won't blame yourself," he continued. "Then, if something's really wrong, and she's not just calling, you'll pick up the phone. Come on." Emily looked down at the phone, the ringing stopped, and she exhaled shakily. But at the same moment, the call came again. There was a strange excitement inside that defied description. After hesitating for a few seconds, she decided to pick up the receiver. "Hello," she asked grudgingly, expecting to hear anything but what Mary would say in the next few seconds. "Joseph. He didn't survive our automobile accident. The funeral will be on Monday. Will you be able to make it, or won't you be expected?" Emily slowly slid to the floor. She expected to hear anything but that. Several minutes of complete silence passed before Brian looked out of the kitchen and was immediately stunned. His wife's face was as pale as a sheet, her eyes full of terror. He slowly approached her, looking into her eyes and asking with a tremor in his voice, "What's the matter? What did your stepmother say to you? What happened?" He crouched down beside her, trying somehow to figure out from the girl's look what had happened. "Daddy's gone" was the only thing the girl could whisper, and tears came to her eyes. She dropped her head to her knees, trying to suppress her sobs. Fear, pain, misunderstanding, and other negative feelings raged inside. Panic was rising more and more. It was getting harder to breathe with each passing second. Breaths were being taken. Circles appeared in my eyes. The funeral had gone smoothly. Emily didn't remember exactly what had happened, and the only moment she remembered was Mary, who was now confined to a wheelchair forever. It had been several months since the tragedy. Emily still hadn't fully recovered. She couldn't accept that her father was gone, that she would never be able to hold him again, to hear his voice. But as they say, trouble does not come alone. Emily's health took a serious hit. She was constantly visiting doctors, and sometimes even lay in hospitals for constant checkups. She lost a lot of weight, almost ceased to be happy about simple things, did not leave the house, and often cried. She literally wore herself out, not giving her body the slightest opportunity to recover from the tragedy. And she herself understood it perfectly well, but did not want to change anything. As time went on, the situation only got worse and worse. Emily thought it couldn't get any worse. After Emily's father died, her stepmother Mary said she needed her stepdaughter's help. She explained, "The doctors said I need constant care. I find it difficult to do simple household chores on my own, even cooking a meal. I don't have money for a caregiver. I understand that we had a bad relationship. You never loved me and didn't want your father to associate life with me. But since we've become related, we should help each other through a difficult situation." Brian expected Emily to react negatively, however she just nodded silently. She later told her husband, "I don't care. I'm just going to hire a caregiver for her. I hate her. I don't want to see or hear from her unnecessarily. I don't want to take care of the woman who ruined my father. She's not my family. I'll never be nice to her. I'd rather give my last dime to a caregiver. But I won't live in the same house with her. I don't care." Mary heard Emily's words but didn't object, realizing her stepdaughter wouldn't change her mind. It pained Brian to see his mother-in-law in need of help. He noticed that Mary looked at him carefully, and she thought his face looked familiar. As promised, Emily hired Mary a caregiver for her care and household chores. It wasn't cheap, so Emily took on extra work, staying late, doing what she could to pay the caregiver and have money for herself. This strain was taking a toll on Emily's health. She was losing her attractiveness and her health. Brian's entreaties to take on less work didn't work. Emily refused to help, seeing it as her area of responsibility. Over time, Emily's health deteriorated greatly. She constantly went to doctors, took tests, but no one could understand the cause. Doctors said that she was exhausting herself, not giving rest, and nervous tension leads to exhaustion. Brian looked at the doctor hopefully. "Isn't there anything that can be done? She's literally withering away, so young and she has no vitality at all. She looks exhausted and tired. Isn't there anything we can do to help her? Are we just going to leave her like this?" The doctor was silent for a while, then replied sadly, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. She is exhausting herself, and until she stops doing that, her condition will not improve. So you need to talk to your wife on your own. Explain to her how important this is, that she has to live for you, for your happy future. There's nothing I can do until your wife wants to live. Do you understand me?" Brian walked out of the doctor's office depressed. He realized that nothing was going to work because Emily wouldn't listen to him. He had tried talking to her, urging her to eat better, sleep better, work less. But all these talks had no effect. He realized that his entreaties were useless, and there was no way out. Brian was not going to give up, so he decided to make one more attempt. "Honey, how about we go on vacation? There'll be lots of good food. We'll vacation together and spend some quality time together. We should do that, don't you think? I have to work. I can't go anywhere yet. I can't just take days off. I can't let my bosses down. If I don't, I won't get my bonus. And if I don't get the extra money, what's the point of my job? If I don't bring anything to our family?" Brian looked carefully into the girl's eyes and saw so much pain and despair in them that he felt uncomfortable. He took the girl's hands in his own, gently moved closer to her, and gazed into her eyes. "Please, Emily, for my sake. Let's take a vacation, relax, spend time together and taste so many delicious things. It's been so long since we've been alone together, without work and worries and cares. Let's just be together. I'll pay for the caregiver, all your mother's expenses. Let's just be together. Emily looked at her husband with tired eyes. She didn't want to decide anything, didn't want to take part in any of these fights, didn't want anything from this life. The silence was becoming tense, and Brian realized that his wife's answer was obvious, but he hoped she would agree to spend some time with him. I'm sorry, but I don't want to pass my responsibilities on to you. I promised my stepmother that I would provide her with a caregiver, and that responsibility is mine. You don't have to take over. We'll definitely spend time together when I get a promotion, or when I don't need a nurse. It just takes a little time. Okay, Brian replied, realizing that his wife wasn't going to change her mind or agree to drop everything to spend time with him. But Brian and Emily were not destined to spend a single vacation together as husband and wife. One night the girl became very ill. The ambulance came quickly, but the doctors could not help in any way. Severely exhausted body almost did not fight for life. And a few days later, Brian received a call from the intensive care unit with sad news. Funeral arrangements were made quickly. Emily had never said where or how she wanted to be buried, but Brian was certain that she should be next to her father, that this was the place she rightfully belonged. He handled the arrangements entirely on his own, not allowing anyone to interfere with his advice and guidance. He knew how best to do things and understood perfectly well how things should be. He had buried a loved one before. But at the time of the last funeral, the last time he had seen his mother's lifeless face, he had thought he would never be hurt like that again. But Brian was wrong. This time the pain seemed dozens, if not hundreds of times worse. He wanted to scream, to cry, to be hysterical, but he held on with all his might. He knew that his tears wouldn't help, and probably would only hurt Emily's loved ones more. That day had left an indelible mark on his heart that he would never get rid of, that would always be with him, and that he would have to accept and learn to live with. He could not imagine that he had so little time to enjoy life with the one he loved. After the funeral, the tears flowed. He could not calm down, he could not pull himself together. So after the funeral was over, after breakfast, he came to his sick mother-in-law's bedroom to do what he had long dreamed of. He fell into her lap, shaking with sobs that he could no longer hide. Pain, resentment, longing, and frustration all blended into one emotion that would not let him go. He didn't want to live, didn't want to do anything else in this life. He felt like he was all alone again, a lost and unwanted boy who wandered the empty streets at night. I remembered you at my husband's funeral, Mary said. You looked at me like that. But I didn't remember that look until later. You were the lost boy who needed support and advice. You're the Brian who couldn't recover from losing his mother and who didn't even want to live. You've grown so mature, so strong and beautiful. I knew you would become a beautiful man, but strong people need care and support sometimes too. Need someone to say a few affectionate words, to comfort them in misfortune and help them cope with the most intense sadness. It takes someone to support them, to stay by their side and sincerely believe that everything will be fine. And if you have no one else, if you yourself no longer believe that something else good is in store for you in the future, then I will do it in your place. Mary gently ran her hand through the man's hair, inviting him to share her sorrow and trying to convey in such a simple gesture all the love and care she felt in her soul. She wanted to share it with someone who really needed it. Why me again? Why am I alone again? Why does fate have such sad plans for me? Why can't I just be happy? Can't help but lose the people I care about more than myself. Why can't I? I just can't be happy like all the people around me. And why things don't work out the way I want and desire. Why? Brian continued to lie on his mother-in-law's lap. Tears flowed silently down his cheeks. It seemed that he had already accepted the inevitability of his fate, that he no longer resisted it at all, and that he was ready to accept everything that was happening to him. But Mary was sure that it was not yet over. You know, for every major trial, fate sends you a gift, something you've wanted or needed for a long time, she said. She doesn't just send you trials, she tests you for resilience to thank you afterwards for all your suffering, for your perseverance and persistence, and for the fact that you don't just give up and go to the end. Now you will always have me. I will be there for you. I will support you in any situation, always help you with advice and deeds if you need it. I will help you to get out of this abyss, as I once helped you to cope with the darkness that surrounded you so quickly. I won't leave you alone. I'm not going to let you just give up. Just remember that you are not alone." The woman gently pressed the man to herself, trying to convey all her warmth and confidence that tomorrow would be better than today, and that in the near future everything would be much better than now. The next morning, all the neighbors were shocked that Brian had fired his mother-in-law's caregiver and started taking care of her on his own. He realized that he could not and did not want to stay alone, and that the best solution would be to spend his life with the person who would really help in a difficult moment, who would be there for him, who would support and help with advice, and who would not betray and would not leave in a difficult situation. Brian didn't just start doing all the household chores on his own. He also worked hard on his mother-in-law's health. He wanted to make sure that her life was safe and that she would be able to live many more happy years, even if she was confined to a wheelchair. In the meantime, the doctors were giving a good prognosis, and that made the guy feel much calmer. He was able to calm down a little and began to try to live on. Now, not only without his mother, with whom he once parted not on the most pleasant note, but also without his favorite woman, for whose sake he was ready for a lot, but could not do anything to convince her to live on. Perhaps there was a reward ahead of him for such a serious ordeal, but maybe it was just an experience that he will just have to accept and move on with his life.